This is Audible.
Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of Where Shadows Dance, a Sebastian St. Cyr mystery, by C.S. Harris, narrated by Davina Porter and directed by Megan Berrickman. The author opens with an excerpt from the poem The Six Bards by James Macpherson. The old tree groans to the blast. The falling branch resounds. The wind drives the clung thorn along the sighing grass. He shakes amid the night. Dark, dusky, howling is night, cloudy, windy, full of ghosts. The dead are abroad. My friends receive me from the night. And now, Where Shadows Dance.
Chapter 1. Friday, the 24th of July, 1812. A cool wind gusted up, rustling the branches of the trees overhead, and bringing with it the unmistakable clatter of wooden wheels approaching over cobblestones. Standing just outside the open gate to the alley, Paul Gibson doused his lantern, his eyes straining as he peered into the fog-swirled darkness. Thick clouds bunched overhead, obscuring the moon and stars, and promising more rain. He could see nothing but high, rough stone walls and a refuse-choked muddy lane curving away into the mist. A dog barked somewhere in the night. In spite of himself, Gibson shivered. It was a dirty business, this. But until the government revised its laws on human dissection, anatomists like Gibson could either resign themselves to ignorance or meet the resurrection men in the darkest hours before dawn. Paul Gibson was not fond of ignorance. He was a slim, dark-haired man of medium height, Irish-born and in his 32nd year. Trained as a surgeon, he'd honed his skills on the battlefields of Europe, but a French cannonball that shattered the lower part of one leg had left him with recurring pain and a weakness for the sweet relief to be found in poppies. Now he shared his knowledge of anatomy by teaching at hospitals like St. Thomas's and St. Bartholomew's, as well as working out of his small surgery here at the base of Tower Hill. The dog barked again, followed this time by a man's low curse. A two-wheeled cart loomed out of the mist, the raw-boned mule between the poles snorting and jibing at the bit, when the driver drew up with a guttural, "Whoa there, you blooming idiot! Where do you think you're going? We've got one more delivery to make before you can head home to your barn." A tall, skeletally thin man in striped trousers and a natty coat jumped from the cart and tipped his top hat in a flourishing bow. As he straightened, a waft of gin underlaid with the sweet scent of decay carried on the wind. "We got him for you, Doctor," said Jumping Jack Cochrane with a broad wink. "Mind you, he's not as fresh as I like me merchandise to be, but you did say you wanted this particular gentleman." Gibson peered over the cart's side at the bulky, man-sized burlap sack that lay within. Another name for the resurrection men was the Sack-em-up boys. "You're certain you've got the right one?" "They seem all right." Cochrane motioned at the sturdy lad who accompanied him. "Grab the other end there, Ben." Grunting softly, the two men slung the burlap-wrapped merchandise off the back of the cart. It landed heavily in the rank grass beside the gate. "Careful," said Gibson. Cochrane grinned, displaying long tobacco-stained teeth. "I can guarantee he didn't feel a thing, Doctor." Hefting the heavy sack between them, the two men carried the merchandise into the stone outbuilding at the base of Gibson's overgrown garden and heaved it up onto the granite slab table that stood in the center of the room. Working quickly, they peeled away the mud-encrusted sack to reveal the limp body of a young man, his dark hair fashionably cut, his hands soft and well-manicured, as befitted a gentleman. His pale, naked flesh was liberally streaked with dirt, for the body-snatchers had stripped off his shroud and grave clothes and stuffed them back into his coffin before refilling the tomb. There was no law against carting a dead body through the streets of London, but stealing a cadaver and its grave clothes could earn a man 7 years in Botany Bay. "Sorry about the mud," said Cochrane. "We've had a mite of rain today." "I understand." "Thank you, gentlemen," said Gibson. "Here's your 20 guineas. It was the going price for an adult male. Adult females generally went for 15, with children being sold by the foot. Cochrane shook his head and hawked up a mouthful of phlegm he shot out the door. "Nah, make it 18. I've got me professional pride, and he's not as fresh as I like him to be, even if he was kept on ice afore he was planted. But you would have this one." Gibson stared at the pallid, handsome face of the body lying on his dissection table. "It's not often a healthy young man succumbs to a weak heart. This gentleman's body has much to teach us about diseases of the circulation system." "Very interesting, I'm sure," said Cochrane, scooping up his muddy sack. "Thank you kindly for the business, and a very good night to you, sir." After the men had left, Gibson relit his lantern and hung it from the chain suspended above the table. The lantern swayed gently back and forth, the golden light playing over the pale flesh of the body below. In life, his name had been Alexander Ross. A well-formed gentleman in his mid-20s, he had long, leanly muscled arms and legs, and a broad chest tapering to a slim waist and hips. He looked as if he should have been the epitome of health. Yet 5 days ago his heart had stopped as he slept peacefully in his own bed. The delicate dissection of the defective heart would need to wait until daylight, but Gibson set to work with a bowl of warm water and a cloth, sponging off the mud of the graveyard, and casting a preliminary practised eye over the corpse. It was when he was washing the soil from the back of the man's neck that he found it, a short purple slit at the base of the skull. Frowning, Gibson reached for a probe and watched in horror as it slid in 4 inches, easily following the path previously cut through living flesh by a stiletto. Taking a step back, he set aside the probe with a soft clatter, his teeth sinking into his lower lip as he brought his gaze back to the young man's alabaster face. "Mother of God," he whispered, "you didn't die of a defective heart. You were murdered." Chapter 2. The first rays of the rising sun caught the heavy mist off the river and turned it into shimmering wisps of gold and pink that hugged the wet rooftops and church spires of the city. Standing beside his bedroom window, Sebastian St. Cyr, Viscount Devlin, cradled a glass of brandy in one hand. Behind him lay the tangled, abandoned ruin of his bed. He had not slept. He was a tall man, leanly built, not yet 30 years of age. He had dark hair and strange yellow eyes with an unnatural ability to see clearly at great distances or at night, when reality was reduced for most men to vague shadows of grey. Now, as the world outside the window brightened, he brought the brandy to his lips, only to hesitate and set it aside untasted. There were times when memories of the past tormented his sleep and drove him from his bed, times when his dreams echoed with the crash of cannonballs and the screams of mangled men, when the cloying scent of death haunted him and would not go away. But not this night. This night he was troubled more by the present than by the past, by a life-altering truth revealed too late, and a future he did not want, but was honour-bound to seek. He reached again for his brandy, only to pause as the sound of frantic knocking reverberated through the house. Jerking up the sash, he leaned out, the cool air of morning biting his bare flesh as he shouted down at the figure on the steps below. "What the bloody hell do you want?" The man's head fell back, revealing familiar features. "That you, Devlin?" "Gibson." Sebastian was suddenly painfully sober. "I'll be right down." Pausing only to throw on a pair of breeches and a silk dressing-gown, he hurried downstairs. He found his major-domo, Maury, dressed in a paisley gown of astonishingly lurid reds and blues, and clutching a flickering candle that tipped dangerously as he worked at drawing back the bolts on the front door. "Go back to bed, Maury," said Sebastian. "I'll deal with this." "Yes, my lord." A former gunnery sergeant, the major-domo gave a dignified bow and withdrew, Sebastian yanked open the front door. His friend practically fell into the marble-floored entrance hall. "What the devil's happened, Gibson? What is it?" Gibson leaned against the wall. He was breathing heavily, his normally jaunty face haggard and streaked with sweat. From the look of things, he hadn't been able to find a hackney and had simply hurried the distance from the Tower to Mayfair on foot. Not an easy journey for the man with a wooden leg. He swallowed hard and said, "I have a wee bit of a problem." Sebastian stared down at the pale body stretched out on his friend's granite slab and tried to avoid breathing too deeply. The sun was up by now. The wind had blown away the clouds and the last of the mist, to leave the sky scrubbed blue and empty. Already the day promised to be warm. From the corpse before him rose a sickly sweet odour of decay. "You know," said Sebastian, rubbing his nose, "if you'd left the man in his grave where he belonged, you wouldn't have a problem." Gibson stood at the far side of the table, his arms folded at his chest. "It's a little late now." Sebastian grunted. To some they might seem unlikely friends, this Earl's heir and the Irish surgeon with a passion for unravelling the secrets of the human body. But there had been a time when both had worn the king's colours, when they'd fought together from the West Indies and Italy to the mountains of Portugal. Theirs was a friendship forged in all the horrors of blood and mud and looming death. Now they shared a dedication to truth and a passionate anger at the wanton, selfish destruction of one human being by another. Gibson scrubbed a hand across his lower face. "It's not like I can walk into Bow Street and say, 'By the way, mates, I thought you might be interested to hear that I bought a body filched from St. George's churchyard last night.' Yes, I know it's illegal, but here's the thing. It appears this gentleman, whose friends all think died in his sleep, was actually murdered." Sebastian huffed a soft, humourless laugh. "Not if you value your life." The authorities tended to turn a blind eye to the activities of body snatchers unless they were caught red-handed. But the inhabitants of London were considerably less sanguine about the unauthorised dissection of their nearest and dearest. When word spread of a body snatching, hordes of hysterical relatives had a nasty habit of descending on the city's churchyards to dig up the remains of their loved ones. Since they frequently discovered only empty coffins and torn grave clothes, the resultant mobs then turned their fury on the city's hospitals and the homes of known anatomists, smashing and burning and savaging any medical man unlucky enough to fall into their clutches. Gibson was well known as an anatomist. Sebastian said, "Perhaps Jumping Jack dug up the wrong body." Gibson shook his head. "We plan to check the bills of mortality later today to make certain. But my money's on Jumping Jack. If he says this is Alexander Ross, then this is Alexander Ross." Sebastian walked around the table, his gaze on the pale corpse. Gibson said, "Do you recognize him?" "No. But then, to my knowledge, I've never met anyone named Alexander Ross. I'm told he had lodgings in St. James's Street, above the Je Reviens coffee house." Sebastian nodded. St. James's was a popular locale for young gentlemen. "Who told you he died of a defective heart?" "A colleague of mine at St. Thomas's, Dr. Astley Cooper. He was called in to examine the body. Swore there were no signs of any violence or illness. The man was simply lying dead in his bed when his valet came to rouse him that morning. Cooper was convinced that he must have had a weak heart. That's why I was so eager to dissect the body, to observe whatever malformation or damage might be present." Sebastian hunkered down to study the telltale slit at the base of the man's skull. "Your Dr. Cooper obviously didn't think to look at the back of his patient's neck. But surely a wound like this would bleed. Wouldn't the pillow and sheets have been covered in blood? If Mr. Ross were killed in his bed, obviously he wasn't. Someone must have gone through a great deal of trouble to make this death look natural. And if not for you, he would have succeeded." Sebastian straightened and went to stand in the open doorway overlooking the unkempt garden that stretched from the stone outbuilding to the surgery beyond. Gibson came to stand beside him. After a moment, the Irishman said, "Looks like a professional's work, doesn't it?" "It could well be. I can't pretend I didn't see this." Sebastian blew out a long breath. "It's not going to be easy investigating a murder no one knows occurred. But you'll do it." Sebastian glanced back at the pallid corpse on Gibson's dissection table. The man looked to be much the same age as Sebastian, perhaps a few years younger. He should have had decades of rewarding life ahead of him. Instead, he was reduced to this, a murdered cadaver on a surgeon's slab. And Sebastian knew a deep and abiding fury directed toward whoever had brought Ross to this end. "I'll do it." Chapter 3. The milkmaids were still making their rounds, heavy pails swinging from yokes slung across their shoulders, when Sebastian climbed the shallow front steps of his elegant, bow-fronted establishment on Brook Street. "A note arrived a few moments ago from the Earl of Hendon," said Morey, meeting Sebastian at the door with a silver tray bearing a missive sealed with a St. Cyr crest. Sebastian made no move to pick it up. Until a week ago, he had called Hendon father. Sebastian supposed that he might eventually adjust to the brutal realization that he was not in truth the person the world still believed him to be, that, far from being the legitimate son of the Earl of Hendon, he was, in fact, the byblow of the Earl's beautiful errant countess and some unnamed lover. Perhaps in time he would learn to understand and forgive the lies Hendon had told him over the years. But Sebastian knew he could never forgive Hendon for allowing him to believe that the love of his life was his own sister. For that lie had turned their love into something sordid and wicked, and driven the woman Sebastian had hoped to make his wife into a loveless marriage with another man. "Send Calhoun to me," said Sebastian, leaving the note on the tray as he headed for the stairs. The shadow of some emotion quickly suppressed flickered across the majordomo's face. "Yes, my lord." Sebastian took the steps 2 at a time, stripping off his coat of dark blue superfine as he went. He was in his dressing room, pulling a clean shirt over his head, when Jules Calhoun, his valet, appeared in the doorway. "I'd like you to find out what you can about a gentleman named Mr. Alexander Ross," said Sebastian. "I understand he had lodgings in St. James's Street." A small, slim man with even features, Calhoun was a genius of a valet, uncomplainingly cheerful and skilled in all manner of refined arts. And since he had begun life in one of London's most notorious flash houses, some of his more unusual talents would of considerable use to a gentleman who had made solving murders his life's passion. Calhoun picked up Sebastian's discarded coat and sniffed. The faint but unmistakable odour of decay lingered. "I take it Mr. Ross has been murdered?" By a stiletto thrust to the base of his skull. "Unusual," said Calhoun. "Very. Unfortunately, the world believes he died peacefully in his sleep, so this one's going to be rather delicate." Calhoun handed Sebastian a fresh cravat and bowed. "I shall be the model of discretion." Lifting his chin, Sebastian looped the cravat around his neck and grunted. Calhoun cleared his throat. "About the other matter you asked me to look into." Sebastian felt an unpleasant sensation pull across his chest. He ignored it. "Yes?" "I have it on excellent authority that Miss Hero Jarvis will be patronising the opening of the new steam circus north of Bloomsbury this morning." "The what?" "The new steam circus, my lord. It's an exhibition of Mr. Trevithick's latest steam locomotive. I believe the gate opens at 11 o'clock. "I should be back before then. Have Tom bring my curricle around at 1:45. Sebastian adjusted his cuffs. "Tell me, how precisely did you discover this?" "Miss Jarvis's maid, my lord. said Calhoun, holding up a fresh coat of navy bath cloth. Sebastian eased the coat up over his shoulders. "Did you woo her, or bribe her?" "Pure filthy lucre, my lord." Sebastian frowned. "That's not good." "I thought the same, my lord. I mean, there's not many who've my way with the ladies, if I do say so myself. But that woman'll talk to anyone who's willing to pay her price." Charles, Lord Jarvis, stood beside the window of the chambers set aside for his exclusive use in Carlton House, his gaze on the palace forecourt below. Since old King George had slipped irrevocably into madness some 18 months before, the centre of authority in London had shifted away from the ancient brick courtyards of St. James's Palace to this, the extravagantly refurbished London residence of the Prince of Wales. And Jarvis, cousin to the king, brilliant, ruthless, and utterly dedicated to the preservation of the House of Hanover, had emerged even more prominently as the acknowledged power behind Prinny's weak regency. In his late 50s now, Jarvis was a big man, both tall and fleshy. Despite his heavy jowls and aquiline nose, he was still handsome, with a wide mouth that could smile in unexpected brilliance. It was a gift he used often, both to cajole and to deceive. "I tell you it's madness," grumbled the Earl of Hendon, one of 2 men who had come here to Jarvis's chambers to discuss the current state of affairs on the continent. Jarvis glanced over at Hendon, but kept his own counsel. He'd long ago learned the power that comes from listening while other men talk. "It's far from madness," said the second gentleman, Sir Hyde Foley, Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. "Our troops under Wellington are making rapid progress in Spain. At the rate they're going, we could be in Madrid by the middle of next month. And do you know why? Because Napoleon, in his arrogance, has now attacked Russia, and is, as we speak, advancing on Moscow. How is it madness to send British troops to aid the Tsar's defences?" "It's madness for the same reason that Napoleon's invasion of Russia is madness," said Hendon, his face dark with emotion. Chancellor of the Exchequer under 2 different prime ministers, he was a sturdily built, barrel-chested man in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and the brilliant blue eyes that were the hallmark of his family, the St-Cyrs. "We simply don't have the manpower to fight the French in Spain and in Russia, defend India, and still protect Canada should the Americans decide to attack us there." Foley made a deprecating sound. A wiry man in his mid-30s, with dark hair and a narrow, sharp-boned face, the Under-Secretary was proving to be a capable and formidable force in the Foreign Office. "The Americans have been threatening to attack us any time these last 4 years. It hasn't happened. Why should it happen now, when we've revoked the orders in council they found so odious?" "Because the bloody upstarts want Canada, that's why. They have some crazy idea that God has given them the right to expand across the whole of the continent, from the North Pole to the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico." Foley threw back his head and laughed. "Those rustics." Hendon's cheeks grew darker still. "Mark my words, if they don't do it, or try to." "Gentlemen," said Jarvis softly, "these arguments are premature. Discussions with the Tsar's representatives are still at the preliminary stage." It was a lie, of course. The negotiations with the Russians had been nearly complete for more than a week. Only Hendon's continuous vociferous objections had prevented their finalization. "Just so," said Hendon. He glanced at the ormolu clock on the mantel. "Now, you must excuse me. I have a meeting with Liverpool in a quarter of an hour." "Of course," said Jarvis, at his most gracious. He paused, then added with feigned concern, "I was grieved to hear that an unfortunate estrangement appears to have arisen between you and your son, Viscount Devlin." Hendon's jaw hardened. "No." "Indeed?" Jarvis reached for his snuff-box. "Then I must have been misinformed. You relieve me, my lord." Hendon bowed politely to first Jarvis, then Foley. "Good day, gentlemen." After Hendon had gone, Foley came to stand beside Jarvis, his gaze, like Jarvis's, on the scene below. As they watched, the Earl of Hendon emerged from the palace and walked rapidly across the paved forecourt. "He doesn't know," said Foley. "He suspects." "You think he may be a problem?" "He may." Jarvis raised a delicate pinch of snuff to his nostril and sniffed. "But don't worry. I can deal with him." Chapter 4. The coffee house, known as Je Reviens, occupied the ground floor of a gracefully proportioned sandstone-faced building of 4 stories on the western side of St. James's Street. Through the coffee house's elegant oriel window, Sebastian could see a panelled room crowded with cloth-covered tables and chairs, filled, even at this early hour, with men drinking coffee or chocolate. It was an animated scene, the muted roar of the men's voices and laughter spilling into the street as they passionately discussed everything from the latest horse race to Napoleon's invasion of Russia and the new threats of war from the United States. He stood for a time on the footpath, breathing in the scent of freshly roasted coffee and watching quietly. Beside the door to the coffee house stood a second door. Pushing it open, he found himself in a well-scrubbed hall containing a steep, straight staircase that swept up to the rooms above. The stairs were of marble, uncarpeted. As Sebastian climbed to the first floor, his footsteps echoed hollowly. Since he had no knowledge of which rooms had once belonged to Alexander Ross, he knocked at both doors on the first floor. From behind the panels to his right came a surly male voice slurred with sleep. "Go away. You'll get your money next week, I said." The second door was opened by a middle-aged housemaid with an enormous bosom and a crown of curly, fiery red hair inadequately restrained by a freshly starched mob cap. "Mr. Ross?" she said in a rasping Scottish brogue in answer to Sebastian's question. "Och, no, it's old Mrs. Bloom what lives here, sir. You'll be wanting the forward rooms upstairs." She jerked her head toward the staircase and leaned closer to add, "Only you won't find him at home, I'm afraid. Died in his sleep just last Saturday, he did." She stared at Sebastian expectantly, obviously more than willing to talk about the incident. Sebastian was quite happy to oblige. "Yes, I had heard," he said. "We were friends. The thing is, you see, that I lent Ross a book a few weeks ago and was hoping to get it back." "Ah, well, Mr. Ross's man is up there still. Sir Gareth is paying his wages until the end of the month." "Sir Gareth?" "His brother, Sir Gareth Ross." She drew her head back, her grey eyes narrowing with suspicion. "I thought you said you was his friend." "Oh, of course, Sir Gareth." Sebastian affected a self-deprecating laugh. "I keep forgetting Gareth has inherited the title now. And how is he?" She gave a sad, "Not well, poor man. They say he's never recovered from his injury, you know. He was able to travel down from Oxfordshire for Mr. Ross's funeral, but he was that uncomfortable the whole while. Left for the Priory again just this morning, he did. He's had to leave Mr. Poole to pack up everything for him." Sebastian nodded understandingly. "So Poole is still Mr. Ross's valet, is he?" "Oh, yes. Or I suppose we should say he was. He's terribly broken up about poor Mr. Ross's death." She made an impish face and dropped her voice as if sharing a secret. "But then, seeing as how he'll now need to be finding a new position, he would be, wouldn't he?" "True," said Sebastian. "Still, I expect Poole found Ross easy enough to work for." He was fishing, of course. For all he knew, Alexander Ross could have been the very devil of an employer. An unexpected glow came over the maidservant's full, ruddy face. "Oh, Mr. Ross was a lovely gentleman. Ever so charming he was, always giving the children at the greengrocer's up the street rides on his shoulders and bringing them little treats. Why, he even carried a scuttle of coal up the stairs for me once when I mentioned my back was hurting. I was ever so grateful. If the Scotswoman had been young and winsome, one might suspect the late Mr. Ross of having had designs on her virtue. But under the circumstances, Sebastian decided the dead man could be acquitted of any such ulterior motives. Sebastian heaved a melancholy sigh. They do say the good die young. I'd no notion he had a delicate heart. Nor had anyone. A more handsome, robust gentleman you never did see. Did he go out the night he died, I wonder, or have a quiet evening at home? She frowned with the effort of memory. I can't rightly say. I think I did hear footsteps up and down the stairs a few times that night, but then Mr. Ross was a great one for having visitors. And there's always the other residents of the second and third floors, I suppose, said Sebastian. She shook her head. Oh, no. Old Mr. Osborne on the third floor is quite the recluse. And as deaf as Mrs. Bloom here, to boot, while Mr. Griffin next to him spends his summers in the country. And the other set of rooms on the second floor, they've been empty these past 2 weeks. I see. Sebastian held his hat in his hands and gave her an elegant bow. Thank you, Miss... Jenny, she supplied. Thank you, Jenny. You've been most helpful. He mounted the stairs to the second floor as light-footedly as he could, curious to see if it might be possible to minimize the racket. He was reaching the top step when the nearest door jerked open and a nattily dressed gentleman, clutching an unwieldy bundle of clothes, manoeuvred through the opening and out into the hall. A softly plump man, he had rounded shoulders, a thin moustache, and a spreading bald spot, made all the more conspicuous by his attempts to cover it with what was left of his long, straight, dark hair. At the sight of Sebastian he let out a shriek and staggered back, the bundle sliding to the floor with a soft plop. "Merciful heavens!" said the man, groping for his handkerchief and pressing the snowy folds to his loose lips. "You startled me. How long have you been standing there?" Sebastian mounted the final step. It was obviously possible with care to climb the stairs very quietly indeed. He said, "I've only just arrived, actually. I take it you're Poole?" The valet gave a crisp bow. He looked to be somewhere in his 40s or 50s, with heavy jowls and a second chin and dark brown eyes that reminded Sebastian of a sad puppy dog. "Noah Poole, yes. How may I be of service?" Sebastian's gaze dropped to the bundle at their feet. "Off to the clothes fair in Rosemary Lane, are you?" The valet's pale cheeks suffused with colour, as if he'd been accused of doing something improper. He pulled back his round shoulders and said with a lisp that might or might not have been affected, "Sir Gareth has instructed me to dispose of Mr. Ross's clothing here in London." "Makes sense," said Sebastian, pushing past the man to enter the drawing-room beyond uninvited. It was a typical gentleman's abode, all fine dark wood and burgundy and navy silk. Beyond the elegant chamber, used as a combination drawing-room and dining-room, Sebastian could see a second chamber, a bedroom. From the looks of things, Ross might have just stepped out for a visit to his club. Noah Poole was obviously in no hurry to complete his assigned task. "Actually," said Sebastian, "I'm here to retrieve a book I lent Ross a couple of weeks ago. Scott's Lady of the Lake. Have you seen it?" Poole blinked at him a few times. "And who might you be, if I may be so bold to ask?" Sebastian withdrew one of his cards and held it out between 2 fingers. "Devlin." Poole's well-trained jaw hung slack. There were few in this part of London, either above or below stairs, who had not heard of Viscount Devlin. The valet took the extended card with trembling fingers and gave another bow, this one considerably deeper and more obsequious than the first. "Oh, of course, Lord Devlin, I do beg your pardon. He cleared his throat nervously. "I don't recall seeing such a book, but I can assure you I will be more than happy to send it on to you should I come across it."
"That would be helpful, thank you."
Sebastian wandered the room, his gaze taking in the fine Adams cabinetry, the lyre-backed chairs covered in striped silk, the engraved invitations tucked into the frames of the gilded mirror over the hearth. Pausing, he found himself studying an invitation to that evening's reception for the Russian ambassador at St. James's Palace. Behind him, Poole cleared his throat.
"I understand you have something of a reputation for solving murders."
Sebastian glanced over at him.
"Yes." "But Mr. Ross died in his sleep. I discovered him myself."
"Must have been quite a shock for you." Poole fumbled again for his handkerchief.
"Indeed it was. You've no notion. I fear I've yet to recover my equilibrium."
Sebastian continued his slow perusal of the room. He would need to come back later tonight for a more thorough and private search.
Had Ross done anything unusual the day of his death? Anything that might have taxed his heart? Not to my knowledge, no. He was out most of the previous evening, so he arose a trifle later than normal, but Sir Hyde was never too particular about that sort of thing.
Sebastian swung around to stare back at the round little man.
"Sir Hyde? You mean Sir Hyde Foley?"
Sir Hyde Foley was the Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs.
Which meant that the murdered Mr. Ross must— "But of course," said Poole. "Mr. Ross worked for Sir Hyde at the Foreign Office."
Chapter 5. Sebastian's gaze went again to the invitation to that evening's reception at St. James's Palace. The quiet murder of the unknown Mr. Ross had demanded investigation, but the stealthy assassination of a young gentleman from the Foreign Office opened up a host of disturbing possibilities.
"At what time did Mr. Ross return from the Foreign Office that evening?" asked Sebastian.
Poole frowned with a strain of remembrance.
"A little later than the usual time, I believe, although it's difficult to remember for certain now."
"Did he go out again that night?"
"I couldn't say, my lord. You see, it wasn't long after his return that Mr. Ross informed me he wouldn't be needing me for the remainder of the evening."
Poole hesitated.
"Actually, I had the impression he was expecting someone later that night."
"A man or a woman?"
"I was not informed."
"Is your chamber here, on the second floor?"
Poole shook his head.
"No, my lord. I'm in the attic."
He nodded to a bell pull near the hearth.
"Mr. Ross could summon me whenever I was desired, but he did like his privacy."
"How long have you been with Mr. Ross?"
"Ever since his return from Russia."
"Ross was in Russia?"
"Yes, my lord."
Once again, Sebastian's gaze returned to the invitation tucked into the gilded frame. As heir to the Earl of Hendon, he had received a similar invitation. He'd had no intention of attending before. But now— He realized Noah Poole was still speaking.
"And I've more than 20 years of experience as a gentleman's gentleman," he was saying. "So if you would by chance know of anyone who is in need of a valet, I've excellent recommendations."
The valet stood with his hands together as if in prayer, his lower lip caught between his teeth, his eyes wide and hopeful.
"If I hear of anything, I'll be certain to pass your name along."
Noah Poole gave a grateful nod and bowed. Sebastian was turning to leave when Poole cleared his throat again and said,
"You might try speaking to Madame Champagne."
Sebastian paused to glance back at him.
"Who?"
"Angelina Champagne, the proprietor of the coffee shop on the ground floor. She owns the entire house, actually. She sits by that oriel window most of the day and half the night as well."
Poole swallowed, both his chins pulling back into his neck so that they nearly disappeared.
"In my experience, there is little that escapes her attention."
"Thank you. That might be helpful," said Sebastian,
and went in search of Madame Champagne. But when he entered the fragrant, noisy coffee room on the ground floor, it was to be told that Madame had stepped out and was not expected back until late in the afternoon. Sebastian slipped his watch from its pocket and frowned. It was nearly 11 o'clock. Driving himself in his curricle, Sebastian arrived in Bloomsbury to find the big square just to the north of the new road filled with an enormous circular wooden enclosure that looked for all the world like some primitive fortress in the wilds of America. Vertical boards, 12 to 15 feet high, discouraged the efforts of a motley crowd of curious onlookers from sneaking a peek at the steam locomotive without actually paying to enter the gate. "If I'm more than 10 minutes, walk 'em," Sebastian told the young groom, or tiger, who clung to his perch at the rear of the curricle. From the far side of the palisade came a belch of steam and the shriek of a whistle. The chestnuts snorted and tossed their heads nervously. "Easy, lads," crooned Tom, scrambling onto the seat. A half-grown urchin of 13 years, he was gap-toothed and scrappy, and utterly devoted to Sebastian. "Maybe I'd best walk 'em now." "As you wish," said Sebastian, hopping down. "Actually, you might use the time to see if you can discover where Foreign Under-Secretary Sir Hyde Foley takes his luncheon." "Aye, Governor." Dutifully handing over his shilling entrance fee, Sebastian pushed his way into the vast enclosure to find an open space circled by a single line of tracks laid just inside the wall. On the far side of the ring stood a small black steam engine mounted on wheels, with a modified open carriage bolted behind it. The engine's boiler smoked and steamed, filling the air with the hot pinch of burning coal. Some 40 to 60 brave souls, ranging from well-dressed ladies and gentlemen to gawking artisans and apprentices, milled about the enclosure. But the carriage remained empty. It was one thing, obviously, to pay 1 shilling for a look at the throbbing, hissing machine, but something else again to actually risk life and limb by going for a ride. Sebastian let his gaze drift around the assembled crowd, looking for Miss Hero Jarvis. It was nearly 11:30. Perhaps she'd already come and gone. "I'd no notion you took an interest in the advances of modern science," said a well-bred female voice behind him. He turned to find Miss Jarvis regarding him with an expression he found impossible to decipher. She was a tall young woman, nearly as tall as her powerful father, Lord Jarvis. No one would ever describe her as pretty, although she was handsome in her own way, despite having also inherited her father's aquiline nose and haughty expression. She wore a carriage gown of soft moss, with a matching parasol she held tipped against the glare of the sun, and a jaunty velvet-trimmed hat from which escaped wisps of soft brown hair. A frightened-looking Abigail hovered behind her, for a single gentlewoman never went anywhere without her maid. "We don't know much about each other, do we?" said Sebastian. He did, in fact, have a passing interest in modern science, but not, as it happened, a fondness for steam engines. "True." She let her gaze rove the crowd of curious onlookers. "Mr. Trevithick hasn't attracted much of a crowd, I'm afraid, and even those who've paid to take a look seem to lack the courage to actually go for a ride. Perhaps they're waiting for someone else to be the first." She brought her grey eyes to his face and smiled. "I'm game if you are." He stared at her. "Me? Surely you're not afraid, too?" Sebastian studied the engine's fiercely glowing fire. "You do know why Watt insists on the use of low-pressure steam, don't you?" "Yes, because high-pressure steam engines can be dangerous, but they can be made so much smaller. This," she gestured with one elegantly gloved hand towards Trevithick's steaming engine, "this is the future." Sebastian rubbed the side of his nose with his bent knuckles. "I hear one of his engines exploded, killing 4 men. Her lips tightened. "That was an earlier design. I tell you, one day engines such as this will propel passenger-carrying vehicles on our roads."
"I like horses," said Sebastian.
"So do I. But I also recognize their limitations. Imagine what working steam locomotives could accomplish if people could only learn to accept them."
With a wry smile, Sebastian stepped to the side of the empty carriage and held out his hand. "Very well, Miss Jarvis. Shall we set an example?"
She put her hand in his. "Oh, Miss Jarvis!" cried the Abigail, her fists clenched tight against her bosom. "You're never going to make me ride in that thing?"
Miss Jarvis glanced back at her. "You may await me here. It's no different, surely, from going with his lordship for a drive around the park." The Abigail heaved a visible sigh of relief.
"Oh, thank you, Miss Jarvis."
As Sebastian scrambled up behind Miss Jarvis, a tall, dark-haired man with a craggy face dominated by a large nose nodded to the engineer. A shrill whistle cut through the air, eliciting a shriek from those nearby. The engineer opened a valve. There was a rush of steam, and the engine's wheels began to turn. With a sharp jerk, the carriage lurched forward. "How fast can it go?" shouted Sebastian over the whoosh of steam leaving the cylinders and the roar of the crowd.
12 miles an hour,
she shouted back, her hand tightening on the handle of her parasol.
"But you didn't come here to talk to me about steam engines, did you, Lord Devlin?"
Sebastian met her gaze squarely. "You know why I'm here." 2 months before, they had faced death together, trapped in the subterranean vaults beneath the abandoned gardens of a long-vanished Renaissance palace. In a moment of desperate weakness, they had sought comfort in each other's arms. Only they had cheated death. And now it had become apparent that those moments of unexpected intimacy had resulted in an unintended consequence. Thus far, Lord Jarvis's indomitable daughter had determinedly resisted all Sebastian's efforts to convince her to accept the protection of his name. But he was not one to give up so easily. He said, "Have you reconsidered my proposal?" She held his gaze without flinching, although he noticed her throat tightening as she swallowed. "In point of fact, I have." "And?"
"I have decided you are right. It is in the best interests of all concerned that I accept your generous offer. Therefore, I would be honored to be your wife, my lord."
She paused, then added,
"Preferably as soon as possible."
Chapter 6. Her response caught Sebastian so completely by surprise that for a moment he could only stare at her in stunned silence. A wry sparkle lit up her eyes. "Didn't expect that, did you?" "To be honest, no. But believe me when I say that I will never give you cause to regret this decision." She responded with what sounded suspiciously like a derisive snort. "Personally, I've no doubt we shall both have multiple occasions on which to ponder the wisdom of this moment." He huffed a soft laugh. Then his smile faded. "What made you change your mind?" When she'd refused his offer before, she told him she'd decided to leave England, travel the world, give birth to their child in some exotic locale, and then return after several years claiming the infant as an adopted foundling. It was a suggestion that had revolted Sebastian on many different levels, not least because it touched on the secret but raw wound of his own cloudy parentage. "It would not have been—" She hesitated, as if searching for the right word. "Good for my mother had I left England. She needs me here." Sebastian had heard that in her youth Lady Jarvis was a pretty vivacious thing, dainty and gay and different from her daughter in most ways imaginable. Then an endless series of miscarriages and stillbirths had ruined her health and debilitated her mind, leaving her easily frightened and more than a little addle-brained. Of the relationship between mother and daughter he realized he had no knowledge at all. "Will she be unhappy to see you wed?" he asked. "My mother? Hardly.
The first time she sees you, she will doubtless fall on your neck and shower you with her undying gratitude. She never could understand my refusal to marry.
Most women do wish to see their daughters established in life.
She started to say something, then obviously changed her mind and looked away. He studied her carefully schooled profile and acknowledged a moment of deep disquiet.
They may have faced death together. They may have joined their bodies to create a new life.
Yet they were still, in essence, wary strangers, while he and her father were sworn enemies.
He said, "I thought I would ask the Archbishop to officiate. Would sometime next week suit you?"
"Arrange the time and place, and I will be there."
"I suppose it only appropriate that I also formally approach Lord Jarvis."
Something flickered in her eyes, although whether it was amusement or a quite different emotion he couldn't have said. That should be an interesting encounter, seeing as how in the past 18 months you have at various times broken into his house, held him at gunpoint, and thrown a knife at him.
"Don't forget that I also kidnapped his daughter,"
Sebastian reminded her. It's how they had first met, when Sebastian had been a fugitive unjustly accused of murder, and Jarvis had been doing his best to avert a scandal by having Sebastian summarily killed. She said, "That too." The steam engine's shrill whistle sounded again, drawing new shrieks from the crowd. She said, "I believe he has meetings with the Prince early this afternoon, but he should be in his chambers at Carlton House later." Belching steam and soot, the engine picked up speed, chugging round and round the tightly circling tracks, the carriage swaying rhythmically from side to side. Sebastian kept his gaze on the woman before him.
"I don't intend to give him the option of forbidding the match."
"I should think not. I am 25 after all."
"He could disinherit you."
"He won't. You are hardly unsuitable. Just—"
"His enemy."
"My father has many enemies." The carriage swung around the track, and she adjusted her parasol against the shifting angle of the sun. "I should like to make it clear at the onset that I have every intention of continuing with the various projects in which I am currently involved." He found himself smiling. Miss Jarvis's projects, which ranged from an analysis of the economic stresses driving women into prostitution to an ambitious study of possible ways of improving the survival rates of infants left on the parish, alternately puzzled, infuriated, and bemused her father. Sebastian said,
"I would not have expected otherwise, Miss Jarvis. After all, I intend to continue with my own involvement in murder investigations."
She regarded him with interest. "Are you involved in an investigation now?"
"No one's been murdered, have they?"
"Not to my knowledge." A great cracking noise cut across the circle. The craggy-faced, dark-haired man started forward with a shout. The wheels of the engine froze with a sliding screech. Sebastian craned around. "What the hell?" "I believe the track has broken," said Miss Jarvis calmly as the carriage lurched sideways. The bench pitched wildly to the right, and she flung out a hand to maintain her precarious perch. "I heard Mr. Trevithick expressing some concern that the engine might be too heavy for the rails." A great gasp went up from the crowd of spectators as the steam engine and its carriage came to a shuddering, lopsided halt. Sebastian said, "Are you all right?" She used the back of her wrist to push her hat out of her eyes. "Quite all right, thank you. But I fear for the success of Mr. Trevithick's new steam circus."
"Keep a smile on your face," said Sebastian, sliding off the seat. Boots firmly on the ground, he reached up to help her alight. She came down beside him in an unruffled swirl of petticoats and artfully balanced parasol. "Oh, that was such fun!" she exclaimed loudly, for the benefit of the excited, jabbering crowd. He leaned forward to whisper, "One of the staves of your parasol has snapped." "Oh!" She quickly closed it. "Thank you." "My dear Miss Jarvis,"
exclaimed the craggy-faced man, descending on them. "Please accept my heartfelt—" "No, no, Mr. Trevithick. Let me thank you," she said, cutting him off. "What a wonderful experience. And do let me know when the tracks are repaired so that I may have another ride around your amazing circus." "You can't be serious," whispered Sebastian as they pushed their way through the crowds rushing forward to gawk at the steaming, hissing engine. "But I am." She drew up just inside the palisade's gate, her gaze scanning the crowd for her Abigail. "Where is that woman of mine?" Sebastian spied the harried, pale-faced maid threading her way toward them. He said, "I'll let you know the details once I've spoken to the Archbishop." Miss Jarvis nodded, her gaze on the Abigail. He found himself studying the woman beside him. She had a streak of soot across her cheek. A lock of soft brown hair had escaped from beneath her hat. The combination made her look both less formidable and considerably more likable. "You won't regret this," he said suddenly. She brought up a hand to shove the stray lock of hair back up under her hat with a brisk motion. "It was always my intention to never marry. To be forced to do so now seems somehow a defeat." He reached out to wipe the smudge of soot from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. "Yet you also told me that your one regret was that you would never have children." An uncharacteristic rush of colour tinged her cheeks, and she tightened her grip on her parasol. "Yes, well, we've already remedied that, have we not?" "Oh, miss!" exclaimed the Abigail, rushing up to them. "What a frightful thing! You could have been killed." Miss Jarvis turned toward her maid. "Nonsense, Marie. I'm quite all right." She nodded to Sebastian with what struck him as a regal inclination of her head. "My Lord Devlin." He tipped his hat. "Miss Jarvis." He stood at the gate, his gaze following her across the square. He was still watching her when Tom drew up the curricle beside him. "What did you discover?" Sebastian asked, leaping up to take the reins. Tom scrambled back to his perch. "Your Sir Lloyd Foley takes his luncheon at the public house on the corner of Downing Street. A cat and bagpipe." Ancient and low-ceilinged, its atmosphere permeated with the wood smoke and spilled ale of centuries, the cat and bagpipe had once echoed with the shouts and bawdy songs of medieval pilgrims to the nearby shrine of Edward the Confessor in Westminster Abbey. Its current patrons were considerably more sedate, being drawn largely from government offices occupying the warren of old houses fronting Downing Street and St. James's Park. Pushing his way through the early afternoon crowd of clerks and MPs, Sebastian found Sir Hyde Foley eating a plate of sliced boiled beef at an age-darkened oak table near the pub's vast stone hearth. A slim man, with pale skin and dark hair, he watched Sebastian's progress across the hazy room with narrowed eyes. "Let me tell you right off," he said, as Sebastian drew up beside his table, "that if you are here as your father's emissary, I am not." Without waiting for an invitation, Sebastian drew out the opposite chair and sat. "I'm told Mr. Alexander Ross worked for you." Foley cut a slice of beef. "He did? Why do you ask?" Sebastian studied the other man's thin, sharp-boned face. "You don't find the sudden death of a healthy young man at the Foreign Office cause for concern?" Foley chewed slowly and swallowed. "Mr. Ross died of a defective heart." Sebastian caught the eye of the plump, middle-aged barmaid and held up 2 fingers. "Mr. Alexander Ross died from a stiletto thrust to the base of his skull." Foley hesitated, with his fork raised halfway to his mouth. "How do you know this?" "That I'm not at liberty to say." "Indeed. So I am simply to take your word for it?" Sebastian waited while the barmaid set 2 foaming tankards on the battered tabletop between them. Then he said,
When exactly did you last see Mr. Ross?
Foley frowned as if with thought.
He died when? Last Sunday?
Either early Sunday morning or sometime Saturday night. Foley shrugged.
Then I suppose I must have seen him that Saturday at the Foreign Office. Why?
Sebastian took a long, slow swallow of his ale.
What precisely were Mr. Ross's duties with the Foreign Office? He dealt with foreign nationals.
Sebastian raised one eyebrow.
Meaning? Meaning that anything beyond that is none of your damned business.
Sebastian smiled and took another sip of ale.
What was your opinion of him? Ross?
Foley shrugged.
He was a good man. A very good man. We were sorry to lose him. Too many young men in his situation would have treated his position in the Foreign Office with negligent indifference. Not Ross. In his situation. What does that mean precisely? Only that his brother, Sir Gareth Ross, is both childless and half-paralyzed from a carriage accident. As the heir presumptive, Alexander Ross would doubtless have inherited, had he lived. Sir Gareth's fortune is considerable. Considerable? I wouldn't go so far as to say that. But comfortable, definitely comfortable. The family is an old one, while the estate, Charlbury Priory, is both ancient and widely admired. Ross was how old? 25? 30? 26, I believe. He'd been with the Foreign Office since coming down from Cambridge. Always in London.
Foley carved another slice of beef.
With the exception of a 2-year stint at our embassy in St. Petersburg, yes. He was in Russia? That's right. By which I can assume that some of the foreign nationals he dealt with here in London were Russian.
Foley raised his own tankard to his lips, his gaze meeting Sebastian's over the rim.
You may assume anything you like.
Sebastian leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed at his chest, and smiled.
I'm told Ross was expecting a visitor Saturday night. You wouldn't by any chance know who that was?
Foley shook his head.
Sorry, no. Do you know if he had any financial difficulties? A mistress? Gambling debts, perhaps? Hardly. We're pretty careful about that sort of thing. Know of anyone who might have wanted him dead?
Foley set down his fork with a clatter.
You can't be serious about all this.
Sebastian ignored the question.
No enemies?
Foley held his gaze.
None that I'm aware of, no. Any recent quarrels?
Foley was silent for a moment.
What?
Prompted Sebastian. The Under-Secretary drained the last of his pint and gave a soft laugh. Sebastian said,
So he did have an argument. With whom?
Sir Hyde Foley reached for his hat, his chair grating across the old stone-flagged floor as he pushed to his feet.
Good day, my lord.
Quickly paying off his tab, Sebastian reached the flagway in time to see Foley turn to stride up Pall Mall, away from his offices in Downing Street. Tom was waiting nearby.
Get down and follow him, said Sebastian, leaping into the curricle to take the reins. I want to know where he goes.
Chapter 7. Paul Gibson spent most of the morning dissecting Alexander Ross's chest cavity. He found no evidence of any heart disease or other natural disability. He was so engrossed in his task that he barely managed to grab time before his scheduled lecture at St. Thomas's to study the bills of mortality for London and Westminster. Published weekly for more than 200 years now by the parish clerks, the bills of mortality recorded the dead in each parish, along with their ages and causes of death. Originally designed to provide a warning against the onset of plagues, the bills of mortality were not infallible, but they were fairly reliable. The returns were compiled by old women known as viewers or searchers of the dead, employed by each parish. Their job was to enter houses where a death had been reported. Since they were paid 2d per body, They tended to be thorough to the point of being aggressive. Of course, the searcher's expertise in determining causes of death was limited. Gibson had no doubt that whatever searcher recorded Alexander Ross's death had simply accepted the diagnosis provided by the renowned Dr. Cooper. But if Jumping Jack had made a mistake, if the body lying on Gibson's slab belonged not to Mr. Alexander Ross, but to some other young gentleman who was known to have encountered a violent death, then his identity would be found in the bills of mortality. Choosing a chair near a dusty window, Gibson quickly ran through the compiled list of deaths by natural causes for the previous week. Aged, 24. Ague, 2. Bloody flux, 1. Childbed, 3. Fever, 235. French pox, 1. Measles, 5. Sighing, he skipped down to the unnatural deaths. Bites, mad dog, 1. Burnt, 2. Choked, none. Drowned, 3. Shot, none. Smothered, 1. Stabbed, none. He checked the previous week, just to be certain. Shot, 1. Stabbed, none. Leaning back in his chair, he scrubbed both hands down over his face. Then he pushed to his feet, returned the bills of mortality to the bored-looking clerk, and went in search of Dr. Astley Cooper. He met the surgeon turning in through the gates of St. Thomas's Hospital. An imposing man with dark eyebrows and thick grey hair flowing from a rapidly receding hairline, Dr. Astley Cooper was long accustomed to hearing himself described as London's preeminent surgeon. In addition to lecturing on anatomy at St. Thomas's, he was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons and a professor of surgery at Guy's Hospital. But it was his flourishing private practice that earned him more than £21,000 a year, a level of success he made no attempt to keep secret. "May I walk with you a moment, Dr. Cooper?" Gibson asked, falling into step beside the famous man. "As you wish," said Cooper, cutting across the quadrangle toward the chapel. He cast Gibson a quick, assessing glance. "I hear you are to lecture this afternoon on cerebral circulation. I trust you've consulted my own writings on the subject?" Gibson schooled his features into an expression of solemn respect. "To be sure, Dr. Cooper. You are the expert, are you not?" Cooper nodded, said, "Good," and kept walking. Gibson said, "I wanted to ask you a few questions about Alexander Ross." Cooper frowned. "Who?" "The young gentleman who was found dead in his rooms on St. James's Street last Sunday. The one you said died of a defective heart." "Ah, yes, I remember now. What about him?" "I was wondering if you were told he had a history of pleurisy, or perhaps carditis." Cooper shrugged. "How would I know? The man was no patient of mine." "No one gave you a medical history?" "I was told simply that he appeared healthy to all who knew him." "And you saw no signs of disorder in the room? Nothing out of place?" "What a preposterous question. The man died peacefully in his sleep. He wasn't thrashing about in his death throes, if that's what you're suggesting." "There were no signs of blood on the sheets?" "Why on earth would there be? The man died of morbus cordis." The surgeon's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my diagnosis?" "Not at all. Simply curious." Gibson drew up. "Thank you. You've been most helpful." He started to turn away, then swung back around when a thought occurred to him. "Just one more question, Dr. Cooper." The surgeon tightened his prominent bulbous jaw. "Yes, what now?" "I was wondering, who called you to Mr. Ross's bedside that morning?" "Who called me?" "Sir Hyde Foley. Why do you ask?" Chapter 8. Sir Henry Lovejoy, once the Chief Magistrate at Queen Square, now the newest of Bow Street's 3 stipendiary magistrates, drew a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed its snowy folds against his damp upper lip. The day had grown uncomfortably warm, the insects in the surrounding dank grass setting up a loud, maddening hum that seemed somehow to accentuate the foul stench of death and decay rising from the body before him. Wrapped in a dirty canvas, the unidentified corpse lay half-hidden in a weed-choked ditch on the edge of Bethnal Green, a wretched, insalubrious area on the north-eastern fringes of London. The district was a favourite dumping ground for dead cats and dogs, unwanted babies, and victims of murder.
"He ain't a pretty sight, I'm afraid,"
said Constable O'Neill, a stout, middle-aged man with florid jowls and a prominent nose. Slopping noisily through several inches of slimy water, he leaned over with a grunt to draw back a corner of the canvas and reveal a bloated, discoloured nightmare of a face.
"Good God!"
Lovejoy bunched the handkerchief against his nostrils.
"Cover it up again, quickly, before the children see it."
The constable threw a sceptical glance at the knot of ragged half-grown urchins who'd gathered nearby to gawk at them and dropped the canvas.
"Yes, sir."
Normally, the discovery of another body in one of the poorest districts of London was of no concern to Bow Street, but there were circumstances surrounding this man's death that Lovejoy found troubling. He said,
"So, what exactly have you discovered, Constable?"
"Not much, I'm afraid. You did notice his clothes, sir. They're uncommon fine. The local magistrate reckons the body must have been brought from somewhere else and dumped here. Ain't no gentleman missing from around these parts, sir."
Lovejoy sighed.
"No identification on him?"
"None, sir."
Lovejoy turned to stare thoughtfully across the green toward the dark, grim walls of the madhouse, and beyond that, Jew's Walk. This was an area of marshy fields and tumble-down cottages, of Catholics and Jews and impoverished French weavers. The constable cleared his throat.
"And then there's the lad I was telling you about. Jamie Durbin, sir."
Lovejoy brought his gaze back to the constable's jowly face.
"Where is he?"
"Here, sir."
The constable motioned to one of the ragged boys.
"Well, come on then, lad, say your piece."
Jamie Durbin, a scrawny, carrot-topped lad of 10 or 12, wiped the back of one hand across his nose and reluctantly stepped forward. Lovejoy looked the boy up and down. He was barefoot, the flesh of his arms and legs liberally streaked with dirt, his ragged shirt and breeches 2 sizes too big for his slight frame.
"So, what have you to say for yourself, Jamie Durbin?"
The lad threw a frightened glance at the constable.
"Go on, tell him,"
urged the constable. Jamie swallowed hard enough to bob his Adam's apple up and down in his skinny throat.
"It was Saturday night of last week, sir. Or rather, I suppose you could say, early Sunday morning."
Lovejoy fixed the boy with a hard stare.
"Go on."
"I was heading home along the east side of the green when I seen a swell carriage draw up just here, beside the ditch."
"What makes you think it was a gentleman's carriage and not a hackney?" asked Lovejoy. "It was rather dark last Saturday, was it not?"
"Not so much, sir. The moon was still pretty new, but it was clear, and the stars were shining something fierce. It was a Gentry Cove's carriage, all right. A curricle drawn by a pair of high-stepping dark horses and driven by a cove wearing one of them fancy coats with all them shoulder capes."
Lovejoy studied the boy's pale, delicate features.
"And?"
"I could see the Gentry Cove was wrestling with something big and bulky he had on the floor of his curricle, so I nipped behind the wall of the corner house there to watch, and I seen him dump it here in the ditch. It had rained some that day, and I heard the splash when it hit the water."
Lovejoy's gaze drifted back to the silent, canvas-covered body at their feet.
"What did the gentleman do next?"
"Why, he got back in his curricle and drove off. Toward the west, sir."
"And what did you do, Jamie?"
Jamie dug the bare toes of one foot into the dirt, his gaze averted.
"Speak up there, lad.
barked the constable.
"Answer the magistrate's question."
Jamie's jaw went slack with remembered horror.
I waited till I was sure the cove was long gone. Then I come and took a peek at what he'd heaved into the ditch."
"Are you telling me," said Lovejoy, "that you've known this body was here since last Saturday night, and you only just got around to telling the constable about it today?"
The boy took a step back, his eyes widening.
"I kept thinking someone was bound to find him, especially once he started smelling. But then he just laid here, and finally it got so's I couldn't stand it no more. So I told Father Dean at St. Matthew's, and he said I should own up to what I'd seen."
Lovejoy frowned.
"You're certain this was Saturday night?"
"Yes, sir."
"And when you first saw it, was the body fresh, or was it already showing signs of decay?"
"Oh, he was fresh all right. Why, he was still warm."
Lovejoy frowned.
"What time did you say this was?"
"Just after 3, sir. I remember I heard the night watchman call in the hour as I was crossing the green."
Lovejoy and the constable exchanged glances.
"And what were you doing out at 3 in the morning, lad? Speak up there."
Jamie Durban took another step back, his previously pale face suddenly flushing scarlet.
"Go on, then. Answer the magistrate's question,"
urged the constable. His nostrils flaring in panic, the boy whirled to take off across the green, arms and legs pumping, hair flashing golden red in the hot sun.
"Bloody hell!"
The constable lumbered up out of the ditch.
"You want I should go after him, sir?"
Lovejoy watched the boy run.
"No, let him go. I assume you know where he lives?"
"Yes, sir. In 3 Dog Lane. Lives with his widowed ma and 3 sisters, he does."
His handkerchief pressed once more to his nostrils, Lovejoy hunkered down beside the ditch. The weeds had been trampled by countless rough boots, the fetid water churned and muddied. Whatever evidence might have been recoverable days ago had been lost to the rain and the passage of time and careless men. He glanced up at the constable.
"You've searched the area?"
"We have. Nothing, sir."
The constable paused.
"You want we should send the body to the dead house in Wapping, sir?"
Lovejoy frowned. London had several dead houses or mortuaries for unidentified or unclaimed bodies. But they were miserable, filthy places, most with little space for a proper post-mortem. He shook his head.
"Fetch a shell from the dead house, but have a couple of lads carry the body to the surgery of Paul Gibson on Tower Hill. Perhaps he'll be able to give us something to go on."
He pushed to his feet.
"And check the pawnbrokers' shops and fences in the area. See if young Mr. Durman has sold any men's jewellery or other items in the last week."
"You think he stole something from the body, sir?"
"How else did he know the corpse was still warm?"
"Aye, good point that, sir. Though I suppose—"
The constable broke off, his gaze shifting to something over Sir Henry's shoulder.
"What is it?"
Lovejoy turned to find a tall, bone-thin clerk hurrying toward them across the green. He drew up before them, his breath coming in noisy gasps.
"Sir Henry,"
said the man, his pale forehead gleaming with sweat.
"A message for you from the Foreign Office. The Under-Secretary, Sir Hyde Foley, wishes to see you. At once."
Chapter 9. Sebastian's next stop was the Mayfair townhouse of the woman he still thought of as his Aunt Henrietta, although she was not, in truth, his aunt, or any other relation closer than a distant cousin. Born Lady Henrietta St. Cyr, the elder sister of the Earl of Hendon, she had been married for 50 years to the Duke of Claiborne. A widow now for more than 3 years, the Dowager Duchess still occupied the vast family pile on Park Lane. By rights, the house belonged to her eldest son, but the new Duke of Claiborne was no match for his formidable mother. So while the current Duke raised his growing family in a much smaller house on Half Moon Street, the Duchess continued on as before, one of the acknowledged grande dames of society, and a veritable walking Debrett's peerage, who knew everything there was to know about the members of the upper 10,000. Sebastian expected to find her still abed, or perhaps sipping chocolate in her dressing room, for the Duchess was famous for never leaving her room before 1. But to his surprise, she was not only up and dressed, but in her breakfast parlour partaking of toast and tea and perusing a copy of the Morning Post. "Good heavens," she said, sitting forward with a jerk that set her tea to slopping dangerously. "Sebastian!"
"You're up early, Aunt,"
he said, stooping to plant a kiss on her cheek.
"It's barely past noon."
"Blame Claiborne's eldest, Georgina. Takes after me, poor gal. But as I always say, just because a woman is not beautiful is no excuse for not being fashionable. Unfortunately, that silly nitwit Claiborne married can't dress herself properly, let alone a chit just out of the schoolroom. So there's nothing for it but for me to take the child to the cloth warehouses myself." "Ah." She reached for her quizzing glass and regarded him through it.
"Why are you here, you fatiguing child?"
He laughed.
"Two things, actually. First of all, I'd like to hear what you know about Sir Gareth Ross."
"Sir Gareth?" She looked intrigued. "Whatever has he done?"
"Nothing that I know of." Sebastian drew out the chair beside her and sat. "Tell me about him."
"Well, there's not much to tell, actually. He must be in his early 40s by now, I suppose. Your typical country gentleman, married some chit from Norfolk, a Miss Alice Hart, if I remember correctly. But she died in childbirth barely a year later, and her child with her. He never remarried."
"I take it he's something of an invalid?"
"That's right. Broke his back in a carriage accident a few years ago. He isn't exactly bedridden, but he doesn't get around much, and, well—" She dropped her voice to a stage whisper and leaned forward.
"Let's just say I've heard he won't be siring any sons."
"So his heir presumptive was his younger brother, Mr. Alexander Ross. And now?"
"A cousin of some sort. There were something like 4 or 5 daughters in the family, but only the 2 sons."
Sebastian turned sideways so he could stretch out his legs and cross his boots at the ankles. "What do you know about Alexander Ross?"
"Charming young man. Terrible tragedy, his dying like that."
She opened her eyes wider.
"Good heavens! Is that why you're interested in the Rosses? Dear me."
It was beginning to occur to Sebastian that he had only to express an interest in someone who'd recently died for anyone hearing him to assume that individual had been murdered. He said, "That's all you can tell me about the younger Ross, that he was a charming young man?" Henrietta frowned.
"Well, he'd recently become engaged to an heiress, Miss Sabrina Cox."
"Cox?"
Not one of the Coxes of Staffordshire, mind you. Her father was Peter Cox, the one who was Lord Mayor and then Member of Parliament for London until his death."
"So he was a cit?"
"A very rich cit. The girl's mother was gently born, however, a sister of Lady Dorsey. But her father ran with the Hellfire crowd and plunged so deep that he was forced to sell his youngest daughter to the highest bidder."
"How high a bid are we talking about here?"
"Towed the old reprobate out of the River Tick, or so they say. In his day, Peter Cox was said to rival Golden Ball, divided his wealth between his son and daughter."
Sebastian frowned. "Her brother is Jasper Cox?"
"Yes. You know him?"
"I've met him," said Sebastian noncommittally.
Henrietta huffed a sharp laugh, and couldn't stand the man, obviously. You can. But he's dreadfully well off. Manages his sister's portion until she weds as well. Together they're major shareholders in the Rosehaven Trading Company, amongst other ventures. It was quite a brilliant match for Ross, even if the wealth does come from trade."
"Thank you, Aunt," said Sebastian, pushing to his feet. "You've been most helpful."
She frowned up at him. "You said you were here for 2 reasons. Ross is the first. What is the second?"
He leaned forward to kiss her cheek. "I'm getting married next week."
He turned toward the door.
"Sure what?"
Her teacup hit its saucer with a clatter.
"Sebastian, you come right back here and sit down. You can't just fling something like that at me and then walk away. Sebastian, it's not—" "Oh, Sebastian, you're not marrying Cat Boleyn."
He paused, with one hand on the doorframe, to look back at his aunt, his jaw set hard.
"She's already married, remember?"
He tried hard not to resent the ill-disguised relief he saw flood across his aunt's face.
"Then who—"
She broke off, her eyes widening.
"Good heavens! It's Miss Jarvis, isn't it?"
It was his turn to stare.
"How the devil did you know that?"
She raised her teacup to her lips and gave him an arch look over the brim.
"Well, you have been seen together rather a lot lately."
They'd been seen together because they'd been discussing murder, but he wasn't about to tell his aunt that. He said,
"I'd like you to be there for the ceremony, if you're willing." "Don't be ridiculous. I shall be delighted."
She hesitated.
"You've told Hendon?"
"No."
"Sebastian, however difficult it may be for you to believe, you must realize that Hendon's love for you is real. You have always been his son in every way that counts. That has not changed, and it never will."
Sebastian swallowed the inevitable retort and turned away.
"I'll let you know when the time and place have been finalized."
His next stop was Lambeth Palace on the south bank of the River Thames, home to John Moore, the aged Archbishop of Canterbury.
"So,"
said the Archbishop, pouring a shaky stream of tea into 2 delicate china cups. His movements were slow and deliberate, for he was an old man, pale and grey-haired, his thin body racked by the final stages of consumption.
"If you've already procured a special license from Doctors' Commons, you don't need me."
Sebastian stood before the marble mantelpiece in the Archbishop's chambers, his hands clasped behind his back.
"Nevertheless, I would be honoured to have your Grace perform the ceremony. This is, if you feel you're up to it."
"It would be a pleasure." Moore paused to carefully set the heavy teapot aside.
"Odd that the Duchess of Claiborne made no mention of any approaching nuptials when I encountered her in Bond Street yesterday."
The Archbishop and the Duchess were old friends.
"She didn't know then. She does now."
"Ah, I see." Archbishop Moore held out one of the cups.
"Well, here's to your health and happiness."
He raised his own cup in a wry toast.
"I wish it were something more suitable, but doctor's orders, you know. At any rate, cheers."
"Thank you, Your Grace." Sebastian took a polite sip of the tea. The Archbishop's eyes crinkled into a smile.
"If I might be so bold as to ask the name of the lady." "Miss Hero Jarvis."
The Archbishop choked on his tea and fell to coughing violently. Sebastian started forward.
"Are you all right, sir? Shall I call—"
No. Moore put out a hand, stopping him.
"One would expect that by my age I'd know better than to try to drink and breathe at the same time."
He fortified himself with more tea.
"Miss Hero Jarvis, you say? A fine young woman, to be sure."
He cleared his throat.
"And when would you like the ceremony to take place?"
"Sometime this week, if possible."
Moore nodded. "Thursday, shall we say, at 11 in the chapel here at the palace. You may arrange the details with my secretary."
He stared down at the murky liquid in his cup, a strange smile curling the edges of his lips.
Well, he said, as if to himself. "How very interesting."
Chapter 10. Leaving the Archbishop's palace in Lambeth, Sebastian made his way back to the Je Reviens coffee shop on St. James's Street. This time he found Madame Champagne seated at a small round table, placed so that it caught the sun streaming in through the oriel window overlooking the fashionable thoroughfare. She was an attractive woman, somewhere in her late 40s or 50s, petite and slender, with pale blonde hair just beginning to fade gracefully to white. Her features were fine-boned and elegant, their delicacy thrown into sharp relief when she turned her head, and he saw she wore a black silk patch over her right eye. She watched him cross the room toward her, a wry smile curving her full, generous mouth. "Vicomte Devlin, I assume." She gave the title its French inflection, Vicomte, her accent still pronounced despite the years of exile from her native land. "I was told you were inquiring after me." "May I?" he asked, drawing out the chair opposite her. She spread her hands wide. "Please. I know why you are here." Sebastian sat. "You do. Monsieur Poole and I had an interesting conversation." She gave a barely perceptible nod to the burly, grey-bearded man behind the counter who set to work preparing 2 coffees. "Alexander Ross was murdered, is this not so?" "I never said that." "It was unnecessary." She tilted her head to one side, her remaining eye narrowing as she assessed him. He noticed she tended to keep the right side of her face turned away. She said, "I trust you have a good reason for this assumption." "I have." She nodded. "Me, I suspected as much." "Why is that?" She shrugged. "When a healthy young man who is involved with dangerous people dies suddenly, well, let us just say that if there's one thing I have learned in this life, it is not to take anything at face value." Sebastian waited while the grey-bearded man placed the coffee on the table before them, then withdrew. "How long have you been in London?" "Nearly 10 years. I went first to Italy, then Mallorca." She leaned back in her chair, her fingers playing with her cup, an enigmatic smile touching her lips. "I was acquainted with your mother, you know. You are quite like her in many ways, although not in all." Sebastian held himself very still. Some 18 years before, on a hot, joyless summer day after the death of Sebastian's 2 older brothers, the Countess of Hendon had staged her own death and disappeared to the continent with her latest lover. He had mourned his mother for half his life before discovering that she was, in fact, alive. It had been but the first of several unpleasant truths he had learned. He tried in the months since that discovery to trace her fate. His agents had followed her to Venice and then to France, where they hit a wall built by war and an inexplicable, fearful silence. Now he asked, his voice calm and casual and everything he was not, "You knew her in Venice?" "Yes. She lived in a crumbling old palace on the Grand Canal with—" Her voice trailed off. "Her lover," he supplied. A sad, sympathetic smile touched her lips. "Yes, she used to give wonderful musical evenings. It's how I came to know her. Her lover was a talented composer as well as a poet, you see. They were quite happy. But then he died." Sebastian nodded. According to the last report he'd received, Lady Hendon had eventually taken up with one of Napoleon's generals, but he had no way of knowing if that was still true. Angelina Champagne reached out to touch her fingertips briefly, unexpectedly, to the back of his hand. "You need have no fear that I will speak of these things to others. The past is dead, and we who are alive must go on, yes?" She paused to take a slow sip of her coffee. There was a fragile, ethereal beauty to her features, a tautness that hinted at sadness, and tragedy born with a quiet stoicism, and something else, something mysterious and well hidden. She said, "You know Ross was with the Foreign Office?" "Are you saying you think his work at the Foreign Office had something to do with his death?" "You doubt it? All of Europe has been at war for, what, more than 2 decades?
Over the years, alliances have shifted and recombined again and again, but it is my belief that one day historians will look back on this summer and see it as a pivotal moment in time. You mean because of Napoleon's invasion of Russia? Even without the successes of Wellington in Spain, it was most unwise. But as the situation currently stands— She pursed her lips with contempt. It goes beyond folly to madness. Tens of thousands will die, perhaps hundreds of thousands. We have lost too many already, so many dead, so much of what once made France great, destroyed. And now this. He wondered how many relatives she still had in France, perhaps even serving in the legions that were marching on Moscow as they spoke. He said, "Napoleon claims the Tsar left him no alternative." She let out her breath in an elegant sound of disgust. There are always alternatives. The Swedes and Russians have ended their war with the Treaty of St. Petersburg, while the Treaty of Bucharest has ended the Russo-Turkish War. With their northern and southern flanks thus protected, the Russians will be able to throw all of their forces against the French. Except they're not just facing the French, Sebastian reminded her. Napoleon has succeeded in cementing a new alliance to bring the Prussians and Austrians with him against Russia, only because Prussia's King Frederick William knew his choice was between a military alliance with Napoleon and the loss of his crown. And Austria? Austria has little to lose, and much to gain from a war between France and Russia. Metternich knows this. She was an unusual woman, shrewd and well-versed in current events, and not the least hesitant to state her opinions. Sebastian studied the stark line of the tie for her eye patch, the sun-kissed skin of her cheek. In an age when most gentlewomen took excruciating pains to protect their delicate complexions from the sun, Madame Champagne obviously deliberately sought it out, and he found himself wondering why. He said, "You take an interest in diplomatic affairs? War tends to make us all students of diplomacy, does it not? There is a story that Napoleon once told the widow of the Marquis de Condorcet that he detested women who meddled in politics. Do you know her reply?" Sebastian shook his head. She said, "You are right, of course, General, but in a country where one cuts off women's heads, it is natural that they should wish to know the reason why." Madame Condorcet had been a widow because the Revolution sent her husband, the famous philosophe, the Marquis de Condorcet, to the guillotine. Sebastian's gaze dropped to Madame Champagne's left hand. She still wore a simple gold band on her finger, but the dusky lilac silk of her gown told its own story, for lilac was the colour of sadness and mourning. As if aware of the train of his thoughts, she said, "My husband was Baron Jean-Baptiste Champagne. He was killed in the September massacres in 1792. Sebastian had heard of Jean-Baptiste Champagne. Like the Comte de Virieu and Lally Tolondal, Champagne had been an early supporter of the revolutionary movement before it turned violent and cruel and began devouring its own. He said, "That's when you fled France?" "As soon as I was able? Yes." Her voice quavered ever so faintly, and she turned her head, showing him only her flawless profile as she studied the flow of elegant carriages in the street, the endless parade of gentlemen on the strut. He found himself wondering about the life she'd once lived, and lost, in Paris, about the horrors she must have witnessed before she finally escaped it all and fled to Venice, and about all the lonely years she'd lived since then, bereft, with her memories. They sat in silence for a moment, watching as a plump-cheeked dandy with exaggerated shirt points and a painfully nipped-in waist approached the adjoining door that led to the apartments above and disappeared inside. A moment later, the shuffle of his footsteps on the stairs could be faintly heard above the murmurs in the coffee shop. Sebastian said, These dangerous men you say Ross associated with. Do you know who they were?
No.
Then how do you know they were dangerous?
Again, that faintly amused curving of the lips.
In my experience, men who turn up the collars of their coats and pull their hats low enough to hide their faces are generally to be avoided. Did such men visit Ross often?
Often enough.
And the night he died?
You mean last Saturday?
Yes.
What makes you think I would remember such a thing now, a week later?
Because on Sunday morning, when you heard Ross had died, you were suspicious. I think you gave some thought as to what you might have observed the night before.
She raised her cup to her lips and took a sip.
You are very astute, are you not?
Sebastian said,
Who visited Alexander Ross that night?
She set her cup down with careful attention.
Well, let's see. First, there was a young woman, or at least I assume she was young, although it is difficult to be certain since she wore a cloak and had the hood pulled up. A well-dressed young woman. Her cloak was plain, but well cut. I couldn't see more than that since she also wore a veil. She was no woman of the streets, if that's what you're asking. Did Ross entertain women of the street? Not in his rooms. I've no notion how he conducted himself elsewhere. How long did this woman stay?
20 minutes, perhaps half an hour, no more. She left very quickly.
She came by carriage.
Madame Champagne shook her head.
Hackney, of course.
Sebastian nodded. St. James's Street was the gentleman's preserve. For a gentlewoman simply to walk down St. James's Street was considered a social solecism. But for a woman of quality to be seen entering a gentleman's lodgings alone would mean swift and certain ruin. No wonder the woman, whoever she was, had taken care to hide her face. And then, an hour or two after the woman's departure, a gentleman in evening clothes went up.
And he arrived how?
Walking? But there's no use asking me anything more about him, because I really couldn't tell you. He wore a hat pulled low and an opera cape with the collar turned up, and he took care to keep his head down.
Sebastian smiled.
One of Ross's dangerous men.
Exactly. He stayed how long?
Longer than the woman. An hour, perhaps longer. I'd say it was close to 9 or 10 when he left.
There's nothing you can tell me about him?
Not really. He was neither remarkably tall nor short, corpulent nor excessively thin. His clothes were very much those of a gentleman, silk stockings and knee breeches. Oh, and he carried a walking stick.
Sebastian himself possessed an elegant ebony walking stick. The silver handle was artfully contrived to conceal a stiletto. He said, Mr. Ross himself never stepped out that evening.
If he did, I didn't see him.
Is there another way out?
There is a door to the court, but it doesn't lead anywhere.
Madame Champagne sipped her coffee for a moment, and then said, Ross had one more visitor that night.
Oh?
She nodded.
Shortly before I retired for the evening, another gentleman went up, but he came back down almost immediately.
You mean as if he had found Mr. Ross not at home?
Yes. Or as if Mr. Ross were already dead?
Chapter 11. Sebastian studied the Frenchwoman's fine-boned face, the single half-hooded eye. And how was this second gentleman dressed?
Much the same as the first, evening cape and knee breeches.
Could they have been the same man? She frowned, as if considering this. Then she shook her head.
I do not believe so. They move differently, or at least it must have seemed so to me at the time, for it never occurred to me that they might be the same man.
Sebastian said,
Had you seen these men visit Mr. Ross before? Them, or men like them?
But you've no idea who they might be.
She started to say something, then hesitated.
What?
He prompted. She leaned forward.
Men may hide their faces, but forget that their accents can tell their own story, to those who know how to listen. What kind of accents are we talking about? Mainly Russian, but also Swedish and Turkish, and the occasional Frenchman, of course.
She kept her gaze on his face.
You're wondering how I could know, yes?
He gave a wry smile.
I doubt I would be able to identify a Swedish or a Russian accent, or distinguish a Turk from, say, a Greek. My father was an official at Versailles when I was a child. I grew up surrounded by accents from all over Europe and beyond. It was a game my brother and I played, imitating them.
Sebastian watched her nostrils flare on a quickly indrawn breath, and he knew, without being told, that her brother, like her husband, was dead.
He said, You knew none of these men? I recognized one of the Russians, a colonel attached to the embassy by the name of Colonel Dmitri Chernyshov. I understand he and Ross were friends from Ross's time in Russia.
The name meant nothing to Sebastian.
Anyone else?
She made a face.
Well, there's Antoine de la Roque. Who is he? Once he was a priest. He fled France in the first wave, more than 20 years ago now. He has something of a reputation as a collector of rare old books. He has opened part of his collection to the public, to the paying public, of course, although he claims that is only to keep out the riffraff. Where is this? Great Russell Street, near the museum, although he can frequently be found prowling the bookstores in Westminster Hall. Could de la Roque have been one of the men you saw that night? He visited Alexander Ross regularly, but was he one of the men I saw that night?
Again, that enigmatic smile.
Who knows?
Sebastian was beginning to suspect she knew considerably more than she was willing to reveal. But all he said was, The second man, the one you say went upstairs and came back down again so quickly. At what time was this? Somewhere around midnight. It was shortly before I retired for the night. I keep rooms in another house I own near here, she explained, on Ryder Street, so it is always possible someone could have arrived to see Monsieur Ross after I left here, or Monsieur Ross himself may have stepped out. I would not know. Sebastian pushed to his feet. You've been most helpful, madame. Thank you. She gazed up at him thoughtfully. Yet you wonder why, when I know your reason for asking these questions, I have given you the name of one of my countrymen, a fellow émigré, He had, in fact, been wondering exactly that. The skin beside her remaining eye crinkled with her smile. For some time now, those of us in the émigré community have suspected that there is a traitor in our midst, one who claims to despise Napoleon, and all the while secretly passing information back to Paris. Sebastian had heard such rumors. He said, You think de la Roque could be the traitor? She pressed her lips together and shrugged. He claims he fled France to avoid being put to death as a non-juring priest. Tens of thousands of priests had fled revolutionary France rather than take the anti-papal oath of religion. Those who stayed faced either death or deportation to a penal colony. Yet he will also laugh and tell you he lost his faith in God at the age of 10. Both cannot be true. That doesn't make him a traitor, Sebastian said. No, but it makes him a liar. Remember that when you speak to him. Hero Jarvis sat at the heavy oak table in the library of the Jarvis townhouse on Berkeley Square. She held a pen in one hand, piles of maps and books lay scattered about her. She had intended to devote the afternoon to a survey she was preparing on the few surviving traces of London's lost monastic houses. But the ink had long ago dried on the nib as she stared unseeingly at the garden beyond the room's tall windows. She'd told Lord Devlin the truth when she said it had been her intention never to marry. She might work hard to change England's draconian marriage laws and the unconscionable powers granted husbands over their wives, but she was realistic enough to know that real change was still generations away. And so she had poured the energy that other women her age devoted to their families into studies and articles and draft legislation. She'd told Devlin she intended to continue her efforts, and she did. But she was no fool, and she suspected her life was about to change in ways she couldn't begin to imagine and didn't want. There was also the matter of who would take over from Hero the management of her father's big house on Berkeley Square. Hero's grandmother, the Dowager Lady Jarvis, had long ago retired to her rooms on the second floor and rarely ventured forth to do more than complain or criticize. Hero's own mother, Annabel, Lady Jarvis, was so feeble both physically and emotionally that the mere thought of trying to select a menu or deal with tradesmen was enough to send her tottering toward her couch, vinaigrette in hand. Hero would need to find a companion for her mother, someone capable of both overseeing the household and sheltering her ladyship from the worst of her husband's venom. Jarvis did not suffer fools lightly, and Lady Jarvis's mental stability was always at best precarious. Hero was running a list of possible candidates through her head when the butler appeared, bearing a sealed missive on a silver tray. "A message from Lord Devlin, Miss Jarvis," he said, with a bow, his face impassive. "Thank you, Grisham." She set aside her pen, but waited until the butler had withdrawn before breaking the seal and spreading open the single folded sheet. The message was brief and to the point. "Brook Street, 24th of July. I have made arrangements with Canterbury for the ceremony to be held at 11 o'clock Thursday morning in the Lambeth Palace Chapel. Please advise if this is convenient." The signature was a simple, scrawled Devlin. She sat for a long time, conscious of an uncharacteristic disquiet yawning deep within her. It was one thing, she'd discovered, to analyze the various unpleasant options available to one and choose what appeared to be the most reasonable course of action. But it was something else entirely to find oneself actually catapulting toward that fate. Especially when that fate was marriage to a man like Devlin. Resolutely refusing to allow herself to dwell on all such a marriage would involve, she dipped her pen in the ink and scrawled a simple 3-word answer. "It is convenient." She sealed the note and entrusted its delivery to one of the footmen. Then she went in search of her mother. Chapter 12. The ancient, well-worn paving of Westminster Hall bustled with self-important clusters of barristers and judges in wigs and gowns, who pushed their way through the motley crowds gathered around the stalls of the seamstresses and milliners, law stationers and old booksellers who lined the entrance of the vast, soaring hall. A few discreet questions brought Sebastian to a stall halfway down the eastern row, where a thin, middle-aged man, dressed in gently worn buckskin breeches, a ruffled shirt, and an old-fashioned green velvet coat, stared with thoughtful concentration at a slim volume bound in battered brown leather and marbled paper. He had a sallow complexion, and wispy straw-coloured hair he wore cropped short, which had the unfortunate effect of accentuating his unnaturally long neck and small head. "Monsieur de la Roque?" asked Sebastian, walking up to him. The Frenchman turned to give Sebastian an intense, unexpectedly hostile look. He had pale blue eyes and a narrow face, his nose high-arched and long. "That's right," he said. "And you are Devlin, no?"
I am.
De la Roque held up the volume and said in French,
An early copy of Newton's Method of Fluxions from the library collected at the Château de Syrie by Voltaire and his mistress the Marquise du Châtelet. Here it sits at the stall of some ignorant second-hand book dealer on the banks of the Thames. Bizarre, no?
Will you buy it? Asked Sebastian, answering in the same language. De la Roque tucked the book back into its row of tattered old volumes and switched to English.
If it is still here tomorrow, perhaps.
They turned to walk together beneath the soaring medieval windows. Sebastian said,
I understand you trained as a priest.
De la Roque gave a faint, polite smile.
Under the Ancien Régime, there were but two careers open to a nobleman's son, the sword and the church. My 3 older brothers chose the army. I was the bookish one, which meant I was consigned to the Jesuits at the tender age of 7. If things had worked out differently, I would have been a bishop by the age of 30. Now...
He spread his arms wide, taking in the stalls displaying ribbons and gloves, the maids buying white scarves, the law students with their pale complexions and shiny coats, then dropped his hands back to his sides.
Behold, my noble see. And would you have enjoyed being a bishop?
Rather than answering, he simply smiled and let his gaze drift away.
As flattering as your visit is, Monsieur le Vicomte, I'm afraid I can't help but wonder why you have sought me out. I'm told you were acquainted with Alexander Ross. I was, but I fail to see...
The man's eyes suddenly widened, his lips puckering, as he chewed distractedly at the inside of his cheek.
Mon Dieu! Ross was murdered, is that it? You obviously find the possibility somewhat disturbing, said Sebastian. Why? It is a natural reaction, is it not? To be troubled when one learns of the murder of a friend. Was Alexander Ross a friend? Of a sort. And what sort was that? Ross had a burgeoning interest in rare and old books.
Sebastian studied the other man's small, narrow face. There'd been a few books on Ross's shelves, but none of them had struck Sebastian as particularly old or rare.
He did? From time to time I came into possession of a choice volume that interested him. Any kind of books in particular? Many of my books come out of France. With the dissolution of the monasteries there, countless volumes of astonishing antiquity have been thrown on the market. In France?
De la Roque laughed.
Yes, well, there are ways, you know. When was the last time you saw him?
De la Roque shrugged.
Last week sometime, I suppose. Wednesday or Thursday, perhaps? Not Saturday night.
De la Roque frowned as if with thought, then shook his head.
No, it was earlier. Wednesday. Yes, definitely Wednesday. Interesting. You see, I spoke to someone who rather thought they saw you leaving Ross's rooms last Saturday night.
It was a lie, of course, but it was curious to watch the Frenchman's reaction. Rather than appearing alarmed or angered at the possibility that he might have been observed, he merely shrugged and said, Saturday? No. Whoever told you that was mistaken. But you did sometimes visit Ross at his rooms.
From time to time. Any idea who some of his other sources of old books might have been?
The Frenchman shook his head.
Sorry, no. How familiar were you with some of Ross's other activities?
The Frenchman looked confused.
Other activities? I think you know what I'm talking about.
De la Roque paused at the top of the steps, his gaze on the crowded, noisy square below.
There is a diplomatic revolution underway in Europe at the moment, he said slowly. The man who is your friend this morning may be your enemy this evening, and vice versa. That was Alexander Ross's world. If I were you, Monsieur le Vicomte, I would tread carefully. Very carefully indeed. You are wading into treacherous waters. Is that a threat? A threat? The Frenchman twisted to face him, the light from the hot summer sun falling across his features. Mais non. Consider it merely a friendly warning. He nodded across the square to where the walls of the Houses of Parliament rose, tall and soot-stained. More than mere lives are at stake here. The fates of kingdoms hang in the balance. Russia, Sweden, Austria, Prussia. Believe me, nothing is as it seems. It all sounded rather grandiose and flamboyant, like de la Roque himself. Sebastian said, "Who would benefit from the death of Alexander Ross? I suppose that would depend on what Ross knew." "About what?" De la Roque's eyes narrowed with his smile. "Ah, but if I knew that, then I too would be at risk. And believe me, Monsieur le Vicomte, I am a man who believes in minimizing risks. Yet you're not, obviously, averse to taking risks when necessary. When the odds are good." The odds? Or the price? Rather than being offended, the Frenchman laughed. Both, actually. He hesitated a moment, then said, "There is one man you might find it productive to speak with. A Swede. A Swede. Tall man, blonde, name of Lindquist. Mr. Karl Lindquist." Sebastian frowned. "Who is he?" "To all appearances, he is a trader." "Meaning that appearances in this case could be deceptive?" De la Roque smiled. "Appearances generally are." Chapter 13. His modest round hat gripped in both hands, his mind swirling with conjecture, Sir Henry Lovejoy followed a succession of clerks through the warren of damp, badly lit corridors that led to the Downing Street office of Sir Hyde Foley. He found the Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs seated behind a broad old-fashioned desk, its surface covered with what looked like dispatches and stacks of reports. The room was large and darkly panelled, with a massive mantel of carved sandstone and a window of diamond-paned leaded glass overlooking a court below. As the sombre clerk bowed himself out, Foley leaned back in his chair and breathed an exasperated sigh. "Well, it's about time. I expected you an hour or more ago." Lovejoy gave a slight bow. "My apologies. I was in Bethnal Green at the scene of a murder." Foley grunted, obviously unimpressed. He did not invite Lovejoy to sit. "I called you here because I want to know what the devil is going on." Lovejoy blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I'm referring to this business about Alexander Ross. The man died of natural causes. So what precisely is Bow Street doing, poking around and asking questions about his death? It presents a very odd appearance. Very odd indeed." Lovejoy dredged up a faint recollection of reports of a young man attached to the Foreign Office who had died the previous week. "To my knowledge, we're not doing anything, Sir Hyde." The Under-Secretary's nostrils flared. "Don't even think of playing me for a fool, Sir Henry. I had Devlin questioning me this morning." "Devlin? You mean Viscount Devlin?" "Of course I'm talking about Viscount Devlin. Who the bloody hell do you think I'm talking about?" Lovejoy considered himself an even-tempered man, but he found he needed to draw a deep, steadying breath before he could trust himself to answer temperately. "Lord Devlin may have his own reasons for inquiring into the death of Mr. Ross, but if so, I am unaware of them. I can assure you that he is not doing so in cooperation with our office." "You expect me to believe that?" Lovejoy simply held the other man's cold stare and returned no answer. Foley leaned forward. "Do you have any idea of the havoc that could be wrought if news of this were to leak out?" "You mean the news that Ross was murdered?" "Good God, man, have you heard nothing I said? Ross was not murdered." I was referring to the turmoil that could result if rumours of some bizarre investigation into his possible murder were to be bandied about in the streets."
Foley pushed to his feet and swung away to where the ancient mullioned window overlooked the flagged court below.
"It's no secret that the situation on the continent has reached a pivotal point. It would be difficult to overstate the importance of the diplomatic negotiations currently underway. The last thing we need is this sort of irresponsible nonsense mucking things up."
Lovejoy studied the other man's sharp-boned, tightly held profile.
"I'll discuss your concerns with his lordship." "See that you do," snapped Foley, turning back to his desk. "My clerk will escort you out. Good day, Sir Henry. It is to be hoped we won't meet again."
Chapter 14. Sebastian returned to Brook Street to find a response from Jarvis House awaiting him. He hesitated a moment, then broke the seal to spread open the single sheet with its terse message. "It is convenient." He stared at the bold, almost masculine handwriting, aware of an odd, heavy sensation in his chest. He knew he should feel something. Relief, surely. Combined, perhaps, with a pang of loss, as the future he'd once envisioned slipped forever from his grasp. Instead, he felt dead inside. He became aware of his major domo, Maury, hovering nearby, and looked up.
Maury cleared his throat. "Tom has been awaiting your return, my lord."
"Ah." Sebastian thrust the note into his pocket.
"In the library?"
"Actually, I believe I last saw him headed toward the kitchens. Shall I send him—"
A loud thump sounded from the depths of the house, followed by the clatter of running footsteps and a crash as the baize-covered door flew open. Tom catapulted into the hall. Maury hissed. The boy skidded to a halt, one hand coming up to straighten his hat.
"Begging your pardon, Governor?"
Sebastian's lips twitched.
"Well, any luck?"
"Aye, Governor. I swear, he never knowed I was behind him at all."
Sebastian turned toward the stairs.
"So, where did Sir Hyde go?"
"Carlton House, my lord."
Sebastian paused with his foot on the first step. Since the institution of the Regency some 18 months before, the centre of power in the monarchy had naturally shifted from the Palace of St. James's to the residence of the Prince. There was no reason to assume—
"I hung around," Tom was saying, "hoping he'd come out again, and he did, not more than 10 minutes later. You'll never guess who was with him."
"Lord Jarvis."
Tom's grin fell.
"You already knew?"
Sebastian shook his head.
"A lucky guess."
He glanced at the tall clock that stood near the library door.
"I've another assignment for you. I want you to discover what you can about a Swedish merchant named Carl Lindqvist."
"A Swede?"
Tom pulled a face. The tiger did not hold a high opinion of foreigners.
"A Swede. That's all I know about him."
Tom swallowed his revulsion.
"I'll find him, Governor. Near you fear."
To Maury, Sebastian said,
"Have Giles bring my greys around in half an hour. And Tom—"
The boy had started to run off, but at Sebastian's voice he turned his head, cocked in inquiry.
"Lindqvist could well be something more than a mere merchant. Something considerably more dangerous. Be careful."
Charles, Lord Jarvis, was striding up Pall Mall when Sebastian came upon him. Guiding his greys in close to the curb, Sebastian called out,
"If I might have a word with you, my lord."
The Baron kept walking.
"If you wish to see me, make an appointment with my secretary."
"This won't wait."
"Unfortunate, since it will simply have to."
Without breaking stride, Jarvis turned onto Cockspur Street. Sebastian followed along beside him, the greys held to a walk.
"What I have to tell you can be said here, if you insist. But I think you'll find it's not the sort of thing you'd care to have shouted in the streets."
Jarvis drew up abruptly and swung to face him. Sebastian reined in and nodded to his middle-aged groom, Giles, who hopped off his rear perch, and took a step back to await Sebastian on the footpath. "My lord," said Sebastian to Jarvis. With unexpected agility, the big man leapt up into the curricle to take the seat beside Sebastian. "Very well. You may drop me at the Admiralty. Now, what the devil is it?" Sebastian gave his horses the office to start, his attention all for the task of guiding the greys back out into traffic. "Miss Hero Jarvis has consented to become my wife." Jarvis remained silent. Then he said, his voice calm, "I take it this is some sort of a jest. A vulgar wager, perhaps, or—" "You know it is not," said Sebastian, turning onto Whitehall. "You would have me believe that Hero has agreed to this? Hero?" "Yes." "Preposterous." "Ask her." Jarvis's large fist tightened around the seat's iron railing. "And if I refuse my consent?" Glancing sideways, Sebastian studied the older man's florid, closed face. The thought of having Lord Jarvis as his father-in-law alarmed him almost as much as the concept of taking Hero Jarvis to wife. He said, "I assume you know your daughter better than that. She is determined to wed, with or without your approval." Jarvis let out a sound somewhere between a grunt and a snort. "Why are you doing this?" Sebastian met Jarvis's fierce stare. He tried to remind himself the man was a father with a father's concerns. "Believe me when I say that my motives are nothing except honourable." Jarvis turned his head away. "Pull up here." Sebastian reined in his horses and waited while the Baron clambered down from the high seat. "The Archbishop's Chapel in Lambeth, Thursday, 11 o'clock. Be there or not, as you choose," he said, and drove off to retrieve his groom. Chapter 15. Paul Gibson limped up Tower Hill, increasingly conscious of a faint but unmistakable stench of putrefying flesh that intensified as he drew closer to his small stone house and the adjoining surgery. He was met at the entrance by his housekeeper, a square-faced, foul-tempered matron named Mrs. Federico. "I'm a housekeeper, I am," she squawked, flapping her stained apron at him. "A housekeeper, not some bleeding sexton." "And a wonderful housekeeper you are too, Mrs. Federico," lied Gibson, turning on the Irish and giving her a cajoling smile. "I don't know what I would do without you." She said, stomping after him down the narrow hall. "I told them I want nothing to do with that thing, but did they listen? No. Do you have a key to the building out back? They asked me. Not bloody likely, says I. Why, just keeping his house and cooking his meals is more than a Christian ought to be asked to do, says I. Have you seen what he keeps in those jars of his, says I?" Gibson poured a tankard of ale from the pitcher in the kitchen and headed out the back door. The jars, or more properly their contents, were the excuse Mrs. Federico used to avoid cleaning most of the rooms in the house. He said, "I take it someone's brought me a body, have they?" "If you want to call it that. Then we'll just have to wait for him, they says, like the thing ain't smelling bad enough to put the whole neighbourhood off its dinner." Gibson grunted. She followed him out onto the back stoop. "I've already had Mel Jacobs here complaining, and Mrs. Cummins too. Worse than a bloody charnel house it is." She stopped at the top of the steps. "You don't pay me enough for this," she shouted after him as he cut across the unkempt yard. "You hear? You don't pay me enough." He found the constables waiting for him in the narrow strip of shade cast by the small outbuilding's stone walls. One was a gnarled, grizzled old codger who looked to be missing most of his teeth. The other, a burly, ruddy-faced man, pushed to his feet with a sympathetic grin as Gibson walked up to them. "Pleasant for you," said the constable, nodding toward the canvas-covered shell at their feet. "From Bow Street, Sir Henry Lovejoy." Hunkering down beside the shrouded form, Gibson flipped back the canvas.
Good God. Sorry, guess I should have warned you. The smell should have done that, said Gibson, his gaze riveted by the bloated, discoloured, insect-ravaged face. Quite a sight, ain't he? Is it a he? Asked Gibson.
At this point it was difficult to tell.
Well, it's wearing gentleman's clothes, all right. Found him in a ditch in Bethnal Green, we did. Sir Henry wants to know what you can tell about how the gentleman died, and maybe a bit about who he is while you're at it. Unidentified, is he? Afraid so.
The constable gave him a concise outline of the body's discovery. Then he nodded to the outbuilding's padlocked door and said, Want we should help you move him inside? Gibson pushed to his feet. Please, just, give me a moment first. Unfastening the lock, he slipped through the partially open door and quickly pulled a sheet over what was left of Mr. Alexander Ross. Lady Jarvis's reaction to the news of her daughter's approaching nuptials was at first incredulous, then hysterically joyous. "Married!" she squealed, leaping up from her daybed to throw her arms around Hero. Since Hero stood over 5'10" and Lady Jarvis barely topped 5 feet, the embrace was somewhat awkward. "Oh, Hero!" She dragged Hero down onto the daybed beside her. "And here I'd no notion. Do tell me everything." Hero shifted uncomfortably. She loved her mother dearly, but this was not a tale she ever intended to divulge to anyone. "There isn't much to tell, actually." "How can you say such a thing, when I must have heard you insist 1,000 times or more that you were determined to end your days an old maid?" "Yes. Well, there are certainly undeniable advantages to the married state." She searched her mind to come up with one. "This obligation to drag a maid with me wherever I go, for example. I find it beyond fatiguing." Lady Jarvis looked puzzled for a moment, then gave a shaky laugh. "The things you do say, Hero." Her smile faded, and she reached up to touch her fingertips to her daughter's cheek almost wistfully. "I do hope you will be happy, child." Hero took her mother's dainty hand between her own larger, more capable ones. "I'm quite certain that I shall be. Lord Devlin is above all else a gentleman, and so handsome and dashing." "Yes, he's certainly that," said Hero dryly. She felt her mother's hand tremble within hers and hastened to add, "And you mustn't worry about how you shall contrive to manage without me, for I intend to find a companion for you, someone who'll be able to see to your comfort as well as assist with the household affairs. And of course, I shall be able to visit often. It's no great distance, after all, from Brook Street to Berkeley Square." "Don't be silly. Now is not the time for you to be worrying about me." "I shan't worry about you, but I have every intention of continuing to concern myself with your happiness and well-being." Lady Jarvis tightened her grip on her daughter's fingers. "You know, this is the answer to my prayers, for I don't scruple to tell you that I had quite given up hope of ever seeing you settled." Hero sank her teeth into her lower lip and forced herself to keep silent. "And grandchildren," gushed Lady Jarvis, her eyes shining. "I do hope we won't have long to wait." "I trust not," said Hero. It was some hours later, when Hero was gathering together her papers in the library, that she heard her father's heavy tread in the hall and turned to find him standing in the doorway. "Is it true, then?" Lord Jarvis demanded without preamble, his gaze hard on his daughter's face. "What Devlin tells me?" "It is." Hero went back to the task of assembling her papers. "I hope you mean to wish me happy, Papa, but I expect you know me well enough to realize that I shall marry, with or without your blessing." "I could cut you off." "You could," she acknowledged. Under the terms of her mother's marriage settlement, her father had obligated himself to provide any daughters born of their union with a portion of not less than £10,000. That Jarvis could not avoid. But as Jarvis's only surviving child, Hero stood to inherit a substantial chunk of all property not entailed to the male relative next in line to inherit the barony. In this instance, a plump, vapid young man named Frederick Jarvis. It was well within Jarvis's power to change his will and leave everything to Frederick. She said, "I've no doubt Cousin Frederick would be pleased."
Jarvis made a rude noise. "Cousin Frederick is a useless, addle-brained popinjay."
"True. I suppose you could always use your wealth to endow some charitable institution."
"Enough of this," said Jarvis. "I've no intention of cutting you off, and you know it."
He pointed a thick, steady finger at her.
"But I intend to drive a hard bargain on the settlement. Make no mistake about that."
"I should hope so."
He went to pour himself a glass of brandy from the carafe kept near the hearth.
"The entire kingdom trembles with fear at the thought of displeasing me," he said, "but not my own daughter."
She smiled. "And you know you would have it no other way."
"Would I?"
He set aside the carafe with a soft thump.
"I assume you have your reasons for what you're doing."
"You're the one who's always pressing me to marry."
"But Devlin, Hero. Devlin."
For more than 30 years, Jarvis had dedicated his life to safeguarding the stability of the British monarchy at home and expanding the nation's power and influence overseas. Few dared to stand against him for long. Working quietly and ruthlessly through a network of informants, spies, and assassins, he was the kind of man who valued order and stability above all else, who had nothing but contempt for such maudlin concepts as fairness and justice. As far as Jarvis was concerned, the modern enthusiasm for equality constituted the greatest threat ever to confront civilization. But Devlin was a man for whom power and authority were never sacred, whose values were justice and reason, not expediency and privilege. In the course of his murder investigations, he had not hesitated to probe into the murkiest corners of Jarvis's activities. Again and again he had not only confronted the king's powerful cousin, but dared to thwart him. And Hero had no doubt he would continue to do so in the future. She said, "Can you think of another man brave enough to marry Lord Jarvis's daughter?" At that, her father gave a reluctant laugh. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing as he studied her pensively. She thought she held up under his scrutiny with remarkable calm. Then he said,
"There's something you're not telling me."
Tucking her notes under one arm, she turned toward the door and simply ignored the comment, saying, "Do you go with Mamma and me to the reception for the Russian ambassador at St. James's Palace tonight? Or will you form one of the prince's retinue?"
"I dine with the prince. Which reminds me, Sir Hyde Foley tells me Devlin is investigating the possibility that the young man from the Foreign Office who died last week, Alexander Ross, was actually murdered. Do you know anything about that?"
She looked back at him in surprise. "Ross? Whatever gave Devlin that idea?"
"He hasn't mentioned anything to you about it?"
"No."
"Interesting,"
said Lord Jarvis, turning to pour himself another drink. It didn't occur to Hero until she was mounting the stairs that he had not, in fact, wished her happy. Chapter 16.
"The first man up the stairs must be the one who killed Ross," said Gibson, his hands wrapped around a pewter tankard, his head resting against the high back of an old oak bench in the corner of the pub where he and Sebastian had met for a pint. "By the time the second man came and knocked on the door, Ross was dead. No one answered the door, so he left again right away, thinking no one was home."
Sebastian took a deep draught of his ale.
"It's possible. The problem is, we've no way of knowing exactly when Ross was killed. It could have been long after Madame Champagne had retired for the night. Aye, there is that.
Gibson blew out a long breath.
What about the mysterious veiled woman? Think she was this Miss Sabrina Cox? Gently bred young ladies aren't generally in the habit of visiting gentlemen in their rooms, even if they are betrothed. Yet some still do, said Gibson with a wry smile. They do. If I could meet the lady, I might be able to judge the chances of that myself. Unfortunately, she's in mourning, which means she's gone into seclusion, and the only visitors she's receiving are relatives or close friends. That does complicate things, said Gibson, draining his tankard. Considerably.
Sebastian signalled the barmaid for 2 more tankards.
Although, frankly, I'm more inclined to suspect the veiled woman, whoever she was, is someone connected to Ross's activities with the Foreign Office. According to Dr. Astley Cooper, it was Sir Hyde Foley who called him in to examine Ross's body.
Really?
Now that is interesting.
Gibson waited while the barmaid set the brimming new tankards on the boards before them. Then he said,
What about this French priest, de la Roque? Sounds like a queer character.
He is indeed.
And whatever his dealings with Ross, I'll be surprised if they involved old books.
Sebastian paused, listening to the tolling of the city's church bells, counting out the hour. He took a quick swallow of his ale and pushed to his feet.
Now, you'll have to excuse me. I'm off to visit the Queen.
Gibson raised his tankard in a mock toast.
Give her my regards.
Returning to Brook Street, Sebastian donned the formal knee breeches and tails that were de rigueur for a gentleman attending an official function at the palace.
I had an occasion to ask around about your Mr. Ross, said Calhoun, holding out a fresh cravat.
Sebastian glanced over at him.
And I discovered nothing of interest, my lord. From all reports, Mr. Ross was a congenial, warm-hearted young man, well liked by all with whom he came into contact.
Sebastian wound the long, wide length of linen around his neck.
Except, apparently, by whoever killed him. So it would seem, my lord.
By the time Sebastian arrived at St. James's Palace, the parade of carriages lining up to pass through the ancient brick gatehouse and into the paved courtyard had dwindled, and the crowds of curious onlookers were drifting away. The season was rapidly winding its way to an end. Almack's had already closed. Soon the prince would remove to Brighton, and the vast majority of the great noble families would depart for their country estates, if they hadn't done so already. Sebastian could hear the soft strains of a chamber orchestra playing one of Handel's trio sonatas as he mounted the steps to the vast reception suite. Despite the heat of the summer, the rooms were still crowded, the leading members of society mingling with cabinet ministers, foreign ambassadors, and members of the royal family. The Queen herself, a stout, grey-haired matron splendid in blonde satin trimmed in gold lace, presided over the evening from a richly carved and gilded armchair situated between the 2 main rooms. At her side sat her eldest son, the Prince Regent, and, standing beside him, the Prince's plump grey-haired mistress, the Marchioness of Hertford. Everyone else in the room stood.
"Viscount Devlin,"
intoned the powdered footman. A tall woman in emerald silk, who was conversing with a group that included the Foreign Secretary Castlereagh, looked around at Sebastian's entrance. Their gazes met across the crowded room, and Sebastian saw his betrothed's eyes widen with surprise before narrowing speculatively.
"Well, this is unexpected," said Miss Hero Jarvis, separating herself from her circle and walking up to him. "Whatever are you doing here?" If she felt any awkwardness at their meeting, she didn't show it. But then, in Sebastian's experience, her coolness and self-possession came close to rivaling her father's. Sebastian was only just beginning to realize that in her case, at least, all was not exactly as it seemed.
"I received an invitation," he said,
accepting a glass of wine proffered on a tray by a circling waiter.
London's hostesses are always sending you invitations. You only accept them when you have some ulterior motive. Sebastian gave a soft laugh. From where he stood, he was able to watch the new Russian ambassador, Count Christoph Heinrich von Lieven, bowing low over the Queen's hand. Perhaps I've developed an interest in Russia. She followed his gaze. So it's true, is it? You are investigating the death of Alexander Ross. Word does get around, doesn't it? When the topic of conversation is murder, what do you expect? She stood beside him, her gaze, like his, drifting over the assembled company. I must say, I am relieved to hear someone is looking into it. I personally found his sudden death beyond suspicious. Sebastian glanced at her in surprise. You knew him? He was engaged to marry one of my cousins. Ah. The well-born but impoverished gentlewoman sold off to the highest bidder by her gamester father. She's a relative of yours, is she? She was. My mother's cousin, Charlotte. Dreadful woman. I always thought old Peter Cox got far more than he bargained for with that match. Her son, Jasper, is just like her, but I rather like her daughter, Sabina. And how is Miss Cox taking Ross's death? She's dreadfully cut up about it, as one would expect. Why do you ask? Surely you aren't considering Sabrina as a suspect? At this point, I'm not ruling out anyone. He nodded across the room to where an animated young woman with dark hair and a long, graceful neck was charming the Prince Regent. What can you tell me about the new Russian ambassador? Miss Jarvis followed his gaze. Well, I see you've already identified his beautiful and captivating wife. She's rather difficult to miss. There are those who say Countess Lieven is the Tsar's real representative, that her husband is just a placeholder. But I think that's rather harsh. He's a shrewd man, ruthless on the battlefield, and at the negotiating table. They make a good team. You've met them? We had the senior members of the Russian delegation to dinner 2 nights ago. Sebastian took another sip of his wine. So, which of the military-looking gentlemen accompanying the Count is Colonel Dmitri Ivanovich Chernyshov? There, said Miss Jarvis, nodding to a uniformed officer with a ceremonial sword buckled across a blue coat dripping with gold, gold sash, gold braid, gold plumes. The blonde gentleman with the moustache. Sebastian studied the colonel's broad, big-boned face. You had him to dinner as well? Several times. Good, said Sebastian, setting aside his wine. Then you can introduce us. The Russian colonel was studying a massive full-length portrait of George II when they walked up to him. Devlin, is it? I have met your father, the Earl, said the colonel when Miss Jarvis had made the introductions. He tells us he is a friend of Russia. Yet when it comes to Napoleon, all he is prepared to offer us is words of encouragement. No men. Our troops are rather busy these days, said Sebastian, what with fighting the French in the peninsula and defending our interests in India and the New World. The colonel laughed. You can't seriously consider the Americans a threat? To Canada? Yes. Excuse me, gentlemen, said Miss Jarvis, adroitly withdrawing. The Russian watched her walk away. A formidable woman, that one. Definitely, agreed Sebastian. He studied the Russian's cheerful, full-cheeked face, with its soft blue eyes and swooping cavalry moustache. He looked to be in his late 20s, his high rank obviously less an indication of experience on the battlefield than of wealth and birth. Britain and Russia were much alike in this sense, if not in others. Sebastian said, I understand you were acquainted with a friend of mine at the Foreign Office, Mr. Alexander Ross. Chernyshov's smile faded. You knew Alexander? A shock, wasn't it? We were to meet at Cribb's parlour the very evening he died. But you did not? The Russian shook his head. No, he never showed up. I finally went round to his rooms and knocked at his door, but he didn't answer.
What time was this? Midnight? Perhaps a little earlier, perhaps a little later. I thought it strange at the time, but wrote it off as a matter of miscommunication. Then I heard he'd been found dead in his bed, and it struck me as all the more peculiar. And now you are asking me questions, and I have been in London long enough to know what that means."
He stared at Sebastian expectantly, but Sebastian only said,
"You were friends? For some years now, yes. We met in St. Petersburg when Alexander was with your embassy there. It is not easy being a stranger in a strange land. This time I am the one who is far from home. We would meet occasionally for a drink. Talk of Russia." "When was the last time you saw him?"
The Russian looked thoughtful for a moment.
"I suppose it must have been that Wednesday night at Vauxhall. I formed part of the ambassador's party while Alexander was there with his fiancée and her brother. Lovely young woman, and fabulously wealthy, I understand."
He gave a rueful smile.
"I was quite jealous of my old friend's good fortune, you know. And then, just a few days later—"
He kissed his bunched fingers and then flung them open in an ironic gesture.
"Alexander is dead. Fate is a strange thing, is it not? Fickle and cruel. Know of anyone Ross had quarrelled with recently? Anyone who might have wanted him dead?"
The Colonel's gaze shifted to the painting beside them.
"It's a thought that naturally occurs to one, is it not?" "And?"
He kept his gaze on the painting.
"Alexander was a diplomat by profession. It can be a dangerous game, diplomacy. A dance of shadows in the darkness." "Meaning?" "Meaning, I know some of what Alexander was involved in, but not all." "Yet you know something."
Chernyshov hesitated, then said,
"That night at Vauxhall I chanced to come upon Alexander in a heated conversation with Ambassador Ramadani."
"Ramadani?" The Russian cast a significant glance toward the dark-eyed, dark-bearded man wearing long crimson robes, gold-embroidered slippers, and an elaborately wrapped turban, who was now engaged in conversation with the Marchioness of Hertford.
"Mr. Antonaki Ramadani, the ambassador from Constantinople."
Sebastian recognized the man. He'd frequently seen him, in different clothes, exercising a magnificent Turkoman in Hyde Park early in the morning.
"Ross was involved with the Ottomans?" "That I do not know, but he was most certainly involved with Mr. Ramadani in some way." "Any idea what the subject of their argument might have been?"
The Colonel shook his head.
"Sorry, I only caught the last few words of their discussion. But what I heard was interesting, to say the least. I distinctly heard Ramadani say, 'Don't threaten me, you little English shit, or you will be the one to be sorry.'"
Chapter 17.
"Threaten him about what?"
asked Sebastian.
Chernyshov shrugged. "I never discovered. They saw me then. Ramadani strode away while Ross laughed and tried to pass the incident off as nothing. But I knew he was concerned."
Sebastian was silent for a moment. Chernyshov's light blue eyes glinted with quiet amusement.
"You don't believe me, do you? Russia and Turkey are well known to be age-old enemies." "True," Chernyshev acknowledged. "But since the recent Treaty of Bucharest, we are no longer at war." He shrugged. "Believe me or not, as you will, but if Alexander did not die peacefully in his sleep as we have been led to believe, you could do worse than to take a look at some of the more questionable activities of the Sultan's representative."
Placing one hand on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, the Russian gave a short bow and moved away. Sebastian was watching the Colonel thread a path across the crowded room when Miss Jarvis walked up to him. "Learn anything?" she asked. He turned to look into her shrewd grey eyes. As Lord Jarvis's daughter, she probably knew more than almost anyone else in London about the delicate diplomatic manoeuvring swirling around Ross's death. Yet the fact that she was Jarvis's daughter meant that Sebastian couldn't trust her. And it occurred to him that the implications of that lack of trust did not bode well for their future together. "What?" she said, her gaze hard on his face. He shook his head. "Nothing." She raised one eyebrow. "Are you planning to tell me what makes you suspect that Alexander Ross did not, in fact, die peacefully in his sleep?" Sebastian cast a meaningful glance about the glittering assembly. This might not be the most appropriate setting for such a discussion. "I will be spending tomorrow morning at the site of the old Greyfriars Priory in Newgate. We can speak more freely there," she said, and withdrew. He watched her walk away, torn between amusement and annoyance, and the unsettling realization that his coming marriage would alter his life in more ways than he could begin to envision. From the distance came the peal of the city's church bells ringing out the half-hour. Soon it would be time to pay another, more surreptitious visit to Alexander Ross's rooms on St. James's Street. But first, he had an important stop to make. He ordered his carriage and set off for Covent Garden. Auburn-haired and beautiful, Cat Boleyn sat at her dressing-table, the flickering candlelight casting a golden glow across her bare shoulders, her slender arms raised as she eased the pins from her dark hair. She looked up when he slipped into the room. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for one telling moment her breath caught. She was the toast of the London stage, an actress famed for both her talent and her beauty. She was also the natural daughter of Alistair St. Cyr, the 5th Earl of Hendon, and the love of Sebastian's life. "Devlin," she whispered. She did not move. He stood for a moment, his shoulders pressed against the closed door behind him. He had loved this woman for nearly a third of his life. Once he'd sworn to make her his wife, and to hell with the consequences. Then fate and a long, sordid tangle of lies had intervened. Now she was married to a man named Russell Yates, a dashing privateer whose secret sexual inclinations remained one of the few taboos still rigidly enforced by their otherwise lax society. While Sebastian was about to marry the daughter of his worst enemy. He said, "I'm sorry for coming here, but I had to see you." She studied his face in the mirror. The effects of too many sleepless nights and too many brandies would be obvious to anyone who knew him as well as Cat. She said, "I'd heard you were wounded. Are you all right?" He touched his arm, injured the week before in a fight to catch the killer of the Bishop of London. "It's stiff, but that is all." He drew a deep breath. "There's something I must tell you. I've asked Miss Hero Jarvis to be my wife." "Jarvis?" She went white, the only sound the clatter of one of her hairpins hitting the surface of the dressing-table. Once Lord Jarvis had threatened her with torture and death. She had found a refuge of sorts through her marriage to Yates, but they both knew she would never really be safe from someone like Jarvis. She let out a strange sound that might have been a shaky laugh. "I suppose there must be a reason for this, but I can't at the moment imagine what it is." "There is a reason." It was all he could say. He supposed the reason would be obvious enough in a few months' time, but it was not something he ever intended to confirm. He owed Miss Jarvis that. "Does Hendon know?" "Of the marriage? No." "I think you should be the one to tell him." When he didn't answer, she drew in a quick breath, and then another. Yet her voice was still a harsh whisper when she said, "You know I wish you happy, Sebastian." She hesitated, as if searching for something pleasant to say.
She does not seem overly much like her father.
No, I don't believe she is.
Overly much, he thought, although he didn't say it. He watched Kat remove the last pins from her hair to send it cascading about her shoulders. The urge to reach out and touch her, to run his fingers through that heavy auburn fall, to draw her into his arms was so intense that he shuddered with it. She said,
"I hear you are investigating the death of Alexander Ross."
He was startled enough to smile.
Is there anyone in London who does not know of it at this point?
Probably not. He studied the familiar contours of her face, the wide, sensual mouth and childlike nose, the intense blue eyes she had inherited from her father. He knew that once she had worked for the French, passing along secrets she hoped would aid her mother's people, the Irish. It had been more than a year now since she'd severed her connections to Napoleon's agents, but that had been before, when they'd still been lovers, the truth of the connection between them blissfully unknown. It was possible, he supposed, that her relationship with the French had been resumed. He knew that her husband, Yates, still maintained his contacts with the smugglers who plied the perilous waters between England and the continent. He said,
"Have you heard anything about Ross's death?"
She shook her head.
"No, but I can make some inquiries if you'd like."
It might be helpful to know more about his activities.
"I'll let you know if I learn anything." She pushed up from her bench and turned to face him, her hands at her sides, her fingers curling around the edge of the table behind her. She wore only a petticoat and a chemise beneath a short corset. He could see the heavy velvet folds of her costume thrown over a nearby chest. Her breasts were high and full, swelling above the confines of her corset. Her eyes shone wide and luminous in the candlelight, and for one dangerous moment out of time, he lost himself in looking at her. She said, "I never would have married you. You know that, don't you?"
"I've been saying it for nearly 10 years now. If things had turned out differently, I could have made you change your mind, eventually."
She laughed at that, a low, sad laugh, rich with love and all the years they'd lost, and all the years they'd shared.
"Oh, Sebastian, always so cocksure and arrogant, so certain that somehow the world can be put to right."
Her smile faded, and she gave a little shake of her head.
"I realized long ago that if I truly loved you, and I do, that I couldn't ruin you by marrying you. The only way I could ever have married you is if I were to fall out of love with you, and that will never happen."
He felt an ache pull across his chest, but he managed to keep his own tone light.
"Is this supposed to make me feel better?"
"It would, if you could ever be brought to believe it."
"I can't."
"Believe it, Sebastian. Believe it."
She came to him then, her skin soft beneath his touch, her hair sliding across his fingers as he drew her close, her lips yielding to his. It was a kiss of heartbreak and hopeless passion, of a wild, all-consuming yearning. And a last goodbye. She was the one who pulled away first, but still her lips came back to brush his again and again before she finally brought her fingers up to press them against his mouth. "I will always love you," she said, her forehead touching his, her breath mingling hard with his. "And I know you will always love me. But that doesn't mean you can't learn to love someone else." He looked into her blue, sincere eyes.
"And you, Kat, have you learned to love Yates?"
She drew back then, her lips swollen from his kisses, her chest still rising and falling with her rapid breathing.
"That's different." Yet you think I can be happy, knowing you are not.
It is what I would wish. He gave her a crooked smile.
And you say I am the one who likes to believe the world can somehow always be put to rights.
Chapter 18. The night was warm, and the moon nearly half full and unusually bright. Sebastian left his carriage on Piccadilly and strolled down St. James's Street, an evening cape thrown over his shoulders, the heels of his dress shoes clicking softly on the flagged paving. The windows of the gentlemen's clubs blazed with light. Music spilled from open doors, the laughter of ungenteel women carried on a soft breeze. Passing the Je Reviens coffee shop, he glanced in the oriel window. Despite the hour, the coffee room was still crowded, the burly, grey-bearded Frenchman at his station behind the counter. Madame Champagne had obviously retired for the night. Smiling softly at the thought of what she told him, Sebastian pulled his hat low and slipped in through the side door to quietly climb the steep, straight flights of steps. The stairwell was dark, with no telltale slivers of light showing beneath either of the doors on the first floor. The inhabitant of the one, doubtless out on the town, the other, asleep. The servants would long since have retired to their attic rooms. On the second-floor landing he paused and listened. Sebastian's hearing, like his eyesight, was acute. As a child he had simply assumed that everyone could see well enough to read in the dark, and could hear whispered conversations from distant rooms. But in time he'd come to realize that his senses were so keen as to be considered uncanny by most. Wolf-like, Cat used to call him. But he shut his mind to that. He listened carefully, but heard only the distant murmur of voices from the coffee shop and the clip-clop of hooves, the whirl of carriage wheels, the laughter and footsteps from the street below. Reaching into his pocket, he drew out a ring with a cluster of small metal shafts, their tips bent at various angles. Selecting one of the shafts, he slid its tip into the door's keyhole. It was a thieves' tool, a picklock, and it took only a delicate touch and good hearing to slide the tip through the lock's gates and carefully press the levers aside. He heard the final click, and the lock sprang open. Pocketing the tool, he slipped inside and quietly closed the door behind him. The light filtering in through the drapes was dim, but sufficient to enable him to see that the valet, Poole, had made little further progress in his assigned task. The comfortable clutter of a young gentleman's existence lay undisturbed, as if Ross had only just stepped out and was expected back at any moment. Sebastian started in the bedroom, methodically searching through drawers, checking the pockets of the few coats left in the cupboard. But Poole's efforts were most apparent here. There was little left. He found a litter of stray buttons, a chit from Tattersall's, an enamelled snuff-box that looked unused, as if it had been a gift. The framed profile shade, or silhouette as the French called them, of a young woman, shadowy curls framing a winsome face, hung above the bedside table. One could imagine Ross pausing to gaze fondly upon it before retiring for the evening, never to wake again. Except that Alexander Ross had not died peacefully in his sleep. He had been violently murdered, his body put to bed by his killer. So, where had the murder actually taken place? Here, in this room? Or somewhere else? Sebastian went over the room carefully, looking for traces of blood. He found none. Frustrated, he moved to the main chamber. He glanced through the invites on the mantel. In addition to the invitation to the Queen's reception for the Russian ambassador, there were also cards for a function at the Swedish embassy, a dinner with the American consul, an assembly being given by the Portuguese ambassador. Alexander Ross had been a handsome young man, a rising star at the Foreign Office, the heir to a barony, betrothed to a wealthy and beautiful woman. The combination had obviously made him a popular guest in diplomatic circles. Turning to a Davenport desk standing near the hearth, Sebastian lifted the hinged top and sifted through the contents of the upper compartment. He found a few tradesmen's bills, but none of them excessive or overly extravagant. Beside the bills lay a sheet of parchment with what appeared to be a half-written letter addressed to Viscount Melville, First Lord of the Admiralty. Sir, I am writing on behalf of a young American seaman, Mr. Nathan Bateman, impressed off the coast of New Bedford, Massachusetts, by the HMS Rodney in June of 1809. The citizenship of Mr. Bateman has been firmly established by documents presented by his father, namely a... There the writing ended abruptly, as if Ross had been disturbed and set the letter aside to complete at a later time. Thoughtfully tucking the letter into the pocket of his coat, Sebastian glanced quickly through the Davenport's drawers, then went to stand in the middle of the room. He was acutely conscious of the passage of time. The longer he stayed, the greater the risk that one of the occupants of the rooms below would awaken, or return to hear the sound of footsteps overhead, or that someone in the street might look up and catch a whisper of movement behind the drapes. He shifted his attention to looking for those things Ross might have preferred to keep hidden. He turned over the clock on the mantel, the cushions on the chairs. He felt behind furniture. Inside the frontispiece of a worn copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, he discovered a folded sheet of parchment. Opening the page, he found himself staring at a curious line of numbers. 7, 10, 12, 14, 17. Puzzled, he was thrusting the page into his pocket when he heard a faint sound, the brush of cloth against cloth, the scuff of quiet footsteps on bare stair treads. Sebastian slipped the book back onto its shelf and moved to station himself beside the door. Whoever was creeping up the stairs had reached the first floor now and was coming around to the second flight of steps. Dressed as he was, in formal knee breeches and low shoes, Sebastian had no weapon, not even the dagger he habitually kept sheathed in his boot. He held himself very still, listening as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. One man only, Sebastian thought. He could hear the man's quick breathing as he paused outside the door. Then Sebastian heard the soft click of metal against metal and recognized it for what it was. A picklock. He smiled into the darkness. He heard the unseen intruder grunt, pleased, but evidently not unduly surprised, to find the door unlatched. There was a faint clatter of metal shafts clicking against their mates as the man put the thieves' tool away. Then, as Sebastian watched, the door latch slowly turned. The panel swung inward, and the intruder stepped into the room. He was carrying a horn lantern, its light carefully shielded so that it formed only a narrow slash. But this was no ordinary thief. Like Sebastian, he wore evening clothes, satin knee breeches, a black coat, silk stockings, and silver-buckled shoes. Sebastian waited until he had taken 2 steps into the room. Then Sebastian reached out, grabbed the man by the back of his coat, and shoved him forward, hard. Caught by surprise, the man stumbled off balance. Sebastian slammed his foot into the back of the man's right knee. With a startled cry, he crashed to his outflung hands and knees. The lantern smashed and went out. One hand still fisted in the back of the man's coat, Sebastian brought his right arm across the front of the man's throat and yanked him back. Sebastian's right hand bracing against his own left elbow as he shifted his other hand to press against the back of the man's head. "What the devil!" exclaimed the man, flailing around with his arms, trying to reach the unknown and unseen assailant behind him. "Who are you?" whispered Sebastian, his lips close to the man's ear. "What are you doing here?" "Who the devil are you?" snarled the man, his nails raking across the back of Sebastian's head and sending his top hat flying. Sebastian tightened his chokehold. "I ask the questions. You answer them." "Bugger you!" spat the man, and threw himself violently to one side. They went down together, pain exploding across Sebastian's ribs as he crashed into a small table that shattered beneath him. Sebastian lost his grip on the man's neck and caught a heel in his groin. His breath left his body in a whoosh, and he rolled reflexively to one side. Scrambling up onto his hands and knees, the man lunged through the open door into the hall. Diving after him, Sebastian caught the man's foot and tried to yank him back. The shoe came off in Sebastian's hands as the man reared up and pivoted to face him. Sebastian saw the gleam of a knife in his hand. "Whoever you are," sneered the man, "you just made your last mistake." Sebastian surged to his feet, the leather dress shoe still in his hand as the man slashed at Sebastian's eyes. Sebastian jerked his head back, the knife whistling through the air. Then he stepped forward and slammed the shoe against the side of the man's head. The buckle bit deep, drawing blood. Swearing, the man fell back, one hand swiping at the trickle of blood running down the side of his face. With a growl, he lunged at Sebastian, the knife clenched in his fist. Sebastian sidestepped and felt his legs slam against the banister. The man turned with a grin. "Got you, you bastard," he said, and lunged again. His back to the banister, Sebastian dropped. With his gaze on the other man's face, Sebastian knew the exact moment when the man realized what he'd done. His lips twisted in a foul oath, the knife still clutched in his hand. He shot over the railing and plunged headfirst into the darkened stairwell. Chapter 19. Sebastian rose slowly to his feet, his breath coming hard and fast. He started to close the door to Alexander Ross's rooms, only to pause and reach in to snatch up his hat from where it had fallen. Then he charged down the stairs. He found the man sprawled near the base of the flight of steps, his eyes open and fixed, his neck bent back at an unnatural angle. "Hell and the devil confound it," said Sebastian softly. He realized he was still holding the man's shoe, a gentleman's shoe, barely worn, made of fine leather with a silver buckle. He dropped the shoe beside the body and eased the knife from the man's tight fist. It was always possible the man had friends waiting outside. Descending the remaining flight of stairs, Sebastian carefully let himself out. A mist was rolling in from the river. Standing on the flagway, he threw a quick glance up and down the street. Nothing. He drew the night air deep into his lungs and felt a twinge where the broken wood of the smashed table had raked across his side. Adjusting the set of his hat, he strode rapidly up the street toward Piccadilly. But when he reached the corner, he hesitated. Since learning the bitter truth of his parentage, Sebastian had refused all attempts at communication from his father. From the Earl of Hendon, he corrected himself. But Cat was right. There was something he needed to do. He turned his steps toward Grosvenor Square. Once, the vast granite pile of the Earls of Hendon on Grosvenor Square had echoed with the shouts and laughter of a large, boisterous family. Now, all were alienated from one another, or dead, the house inhabited solely by one lonely old man and his servants. Dismissing his father's butler with a silent nod, Sebastian paused in the doorway of the library, his gaze on the man who sat dozing in his habitual, comfortably worn chair beside the hearth. He was still a large man, despite his 60-odd years, his features blunt, a shock of thick white hair fallen over his forehead. He had his head tipped back, his mouth slack with sleep, his eyes closed. A book, doubtless the orations of Cicero, or some such work, lay open on his lap. Of the 3 young boys Hendon called son, only the youngest, Sebastian, had shared the Earl's love of classical literature. Sebastian's enthusiasm for the works of Homer and Caesar had delighted the Earl, even if Sebastian's reading tastes did range further afield than Hendon would have liked, to Catullus and Sappho and Petronius. Yet the Earl's pleasure in this youngest child's precociousness had always been tinged with an element of odd perplexity that at times bordered on resentment. It was an attitude that both confused and hurt Sebastian as a child. He'd never understood the sudden icy aloofness that could tighten the Earl's jaw and cause him to turn away. Now he did. For a long moment, Sebastian simply stood in the doorway, awash in a complex swirl of emotions, anger and resentment mingling with hurt, and an unwanted but powerful upsurge of love that startled him by its intensity. Then the Earl's eyes fluttered open, and the two men stared at each other from across the room. Sebastian said stiffly, "I expected to find you abed." "I would have been soon." Hendon wiped one hand across his mouth, but otherwise held himself quite still, as if afraid the least unstudied motion might cause his son, or rather the man he'd called son for nearly 30 years, to vanish from his sight. "Come in. Pour yourself a brandy." Sebastian shook his head. "I'm here to tell you that the notice of my engagement will appear in Monday's Post." Even to his own ears his voice sounded tight, stilted. He saw the delight mingled with surprise and wariness that leapt in the old man's eyes. For years Hendon had pressed Sebastian to marry, to beget the next sincere heir. A supreme irony given that the only sincere blood flowing through Sebastian's veins had come to him from his mother, the errant countess, who had, in that way of noble families, married her own distant cousin. Hendon cleared his throat. "Your betrothal?" Sebastian nodded. "I will be marrying Miss Hero Jarvis on Thursday." Hendon's voice came out in a long hiss. "Jarvis?" "Yes." "What madness is this?" At that, Sebastian laughed. "The ceremony will take place at 11 in the chapel of the Archbishop of Canterbury at Lambeth." Hendon stared back at him. "I'm invited." "Yes." Sebastian turned to leave. "Devlin." He paused to look back, one eyebrow raised in silent inquiry. "Thank you," said Hendon. But Sebastian found he did not trust himself to do more than nod. Saturday, the 25th of July. The next morning dawned warm and clear. Dressed in buckskin breeches, glossy black hessians, and a drab olive riding coat, His Excellency Antonaki Ramadani, the ambassador to the court of St. James from the Sublime Porte, trotted sedately up Rotten Row. He might have been mistaken for any sun-darkened Englishman exercising his horse in Hyde Park. The only exotic touch came from the ambassador's mount, a magnificent bay Turcoman, with a high-pointed saddle covered in crimson velvet. "Good morning, Your Excellency," said Sebastian, bringing his own neat Arab mare in beside the Turk's bay. "I was sorry we didn't have the opportunity to meet at the Queen's reception last night. I am Devlin." The Turk cast him a quick, speculative glance, then returned his gaze to the track before them. "I have heard of you." His English was unexpectedly good, with only a faint, barely perceptible trace of accent. "You're the peculiar English nobleman who enjoys solving murders. It's, what, a hobby of yours?" "I don't know that I'd call it a hobby, exactly." "Oh? What would you describe it as?" "An interest, perhaps?" Maybe a compulsion, Sebastian thought. Or a penance. But he didn't say it. Ramadani raised one eyebrow. "You think that young gentleman from the Foreign Office who died last week, Mr. Alexander Ross, was murdered?" It was a statement, not a question. "And you think I did it?" Sebastian studied the Turk's hard, closed face with its full lips and light brown eyes. "You were seen arguing with him at Vauxhall last, when was it, Wednesday or Thursday?" "Wednesday." A faint smile crinkled the skin beside the man's eyes.
As a diplomat, I am protected from prosecution in your country. Even if I did kill Ross, your government could not touch me. So, did you kill him?
The Turk huffed a soft laugh.
And if I said no, would you believe me?
Sebastian smiled.
No. Then why bother to ask? Conversely, if you have immunity from prosecution, then why bother to deny it? Because while I personally might not suffer from such an accusation, the relations between your government and mine would nevertheless be affected. If it were true, said Sebastian. If it were true, agreed Ramadani.
They trotted together in silence for a moment. Then the Turk said,
How was Ross killed?
Sebastian watched the ambassador's face.
A stiletto thrust to the base of the skull. Know anyone who uses that method to dispose of his enemies?
The Turk widened his eyes.
It's an assassin's trick. An assassin's trick common in the East, yes?
Again, that faint hint of a smile.
I don't know if I'd say it's exactly common, but it is known there, yes.
He paused.
Personally, I prefer the garrote.
I'll remember that, said Sebastian. The Turk laughed out loud and turned his horse to trot back up the row.
Sebastian fell in beside him again. Your argument with Ross at Vauxhall, what was it about?
Ramadani threw him a quick sideways glance. The smile was still there, but it had hardened.
Perhaps you should ask Mr. Ross's superiors about that. Somehow I get the impression the Foreign Office is being less than forthcoming about the events surrounding Ross's death. And you're surprised?
No.
You would be ill-suited to diplomacy, my lord. You are far too blunt and direct.
He gave Sebastian a sideways, appraising glance.
Although I think you can play a role when it suits you, yes? Are you going to tell me the nature of your disagreement with Mr. Ross? There is little to tell. Ross had approached me earlier as the emissary of your Sir Hyde Foley. Let us just say that pressure is being brought to convince the Sultan to join the Tsar of Russia in an alliance against Napoleon. The Russians and the Porte did recently sign a treaty of peace, said Sebastian. True, but a peace is not the same as an alliance. You must remember that the friendship between Paris and the Porte stretches back generations. Yet Napoleon has shown he has designs on Egypt. And the English do not.
When Sebastian remained silent, the ambassador said,
Who told you that I was seen arguing with Ross at Vauxhall?
I'm sorry, I can't say.
Ramadani nodded. Yes, I can understand that.
He drew up sharply, the glossy bay fidgeting beneath him.
It is always possible that your assassin does indeed lurk somewhere in the foreign diplomatic community, Lord Devlin. But if I were you, I would search for him closer to home.
He inclined his head.
Good day, my lord.